Chapter 16. Crisis of Cold. Year 0002, April 21st.
Dibs on the seat by Sephiroth!
The shout made Tseng pause as he attempted to navigate his way around a snowbank that he calculated to be at least 3 feet high. Knowing the terrain in the area, he wouldn't be unduly surprised to find it was actually closer to 5, and there was a hidden dip. A moment later, the point proved useless as Zack barreled right into the snowbank and scrambled over it to continue on towards the idle military transport trucks. Tseng pressed his lips together in mild annoyance and reached up to brush snow from where it had landed on his shoulders. He watched Zack trot up to the back of the trucks among a swirl of exhaust fumes, milling personnel and bystanders. Sephiroth already sat in the back of the nearest truck, his head tilted back to gaze up at the overcast sky. A quiet, barely there sigh drew Tseng's attention back in time to see Cloud Strife making use of the path his boisterous mentor had ploughed. Cloud sent Tseng a shuttered look, then gave a faint snort and kept on walking. Almost self-consciously, Tseng swept the rest of the clinging snow from his shoulders and let out a soft sigh of his own. Around him, Icicle was as quaint and snowbound as ever. The thick piles of unmelted snow settled against the sides of buildings in sweeping slopes, while the obviously trafficked areas were trampled down for the most part. It was still cold enough that he could see his breath misting in the air with every exhale, could feel it freezing in his sinuses with every inhale, but the biting wind that came in from further north during the winter months had eased off. Lifting his head, he shot a glance towards the sky. A few stray snowflakes still drifted down lazily, a holdover from last night's snowfall, but they didn't seem in danger of another storm blowing in. The locals didn't seem to think so either. Silently resigned, though keeping his impassive and professional air about him, he rounded the snowbank at last and picked his way over towards the trucks. There were only 2, as they brought a relatively small force with them. There was no need for anything larger with the company he was keeping. As he drew closer, Tseng heard one of the troopers with them ask, "Are you feeling okay, Cloud? You're looking a little tense." Cloud's quiet response was so low that Tseng nearly missed it. "I'm fine, just—" Cloud's shoulders hunched further in something resembling a shrug. "I don't think the bird agreed with me." The trooper he was speaking with nudged his helmet up a little higher to get a clear look at him, and gave him a laugh.
Only you would be more concerned about the stiffness of a mattress than how cold it is.
Cloud gave another slouching shrug.
You know, I don't think most of the guys believed me about you. They were always—
The trooper cut off abruptly, looking guilty about what he was about to say. Tseng turned his attention away from them to watch Zack clamber up into the back of the truck. Arms spread for balance, Buster Sword held carefully in one hand, Zack stepped around the bundle of black feathers crouched at Sephiroth's feet and dropped into the space next to him. He leaned forward once he was settled and called,
"Stop chit-chatting with Connolly and get up here, Cloud. I'm cold!"
The chocobo crooned softly and attempted to pry one of the buckles off of Sephiroth's right boot. Sephiroth didn't seem to notice.
"You shouldn't have gotten wet then,"
Cloud shot back flatly.
"It'll dry,"
Zack said without missing a beat.
"Now get up here and sit down."
Besides Cloud, the trooper, Connolly, and Tseng made a mental mark to keep track of him in the shuffle of their travel, gave a quiet chuckle.
"I wonder where we'd all be if Zack hadn't found himself a partner in crime."
The thought had sounded suspiciously like Renault, and the antagonistic sarcasm he employed these days when talking about Cloud.
"Wilhelm, what are you doing loitering over there?"
The yell made Connolly wince.
"Sorry, sir,"
he snapped off. He nodded quickly at Cloud.
I'll talk to you later. Maybe I'll be lucky enough to get to join you for the ride. Yeah.
As the trooper trotted off to join the rest of the infantrymen, Cloud strode forward towards the truck. He hesitated a moment, shooting Sephiroth a glance, though Sephiroth ignored him as much as he had Zack. Whatever it was about the cloudy grey sky that had caught Sephiroth's attention continued holding it. Tseng cast a glance upwards himself, and hoped that the locals hadn't been wrong, and last night's snowfall wouldn't be returning. They'd already been forced to stay one night at the inn, and as interesting as the extra chance to observe their targets was, Tseng was quite ready to return to Midgar. His suits were not exactly suited to the bitter cold. He cleared his throat softly, and found 3 pairs of glowing Mako eyes turned to peer at him. It was, admittedly, an eerie tableau. He supposed it was to be expected, when faced with what could arguably be the 3 most powerful, physically speaking, people in Shinra. Tseng hesitated, but before he could decide one way or another, Zack broke through the moment by leaning forward to wave a hand, beckoning.
Hey, Tseng! Nice of you to join us. Come on, Cloud, get up here.
Thank you,
Tseng said. It's reassuring to know we have 2 capable country boys to take the lead. He almost smiled when Zack rolled his eyes. Yeah,
Zack said. Cloud took his hand and let Zack help haul him up into the truck. The young chocobo cooed up at Cloud. He reached down to ruffle its developing crest feathers before he moved further back to take a seat next to Zack. Zack sent him a quick grin, then turned back to Tseng, who stepped lightly into the transport himself.
It worked out fine last time, didn't it?
Tseng gave him a sidelong look, and ducked down to move to the front of the vehicle. He sat down, resting his back against the wall, separating them from the cabin. The metal was icy through the fabric of his suit, but he'd rather be out of sword range. There was also the fact that it gave him the perfect vantage point from which to observe the 3. Once he was settled, discreetly checking the placement of his gun, he cast a thoughtful gaze towards Zack. Zack peered around Cloud at him, brows raised towards his hairline.
What? I think fine is rather subjective,
Tseng answered after a brief pause. Zack's face twisted up in a mixture of sulkiness and bewilderment, but before he could respond, a cough interrupted them. The red-scarfed captain of the squadron that had accompanied them stood near the tail end of the truck. He saluted when he realized he had their attention.
Excuse me, sirs, but we're almost ready to depart, the captain said. The men are boarding now.
He was backed by the troopers that were going to join them in this truck, while the others would be in the second.
That's awesome,
Zack said from where he'd slumped between Sephiroth and Cloud.
The sooner we get this done, the sooner we can get out of this freezer.
Cloud grunted a faint affirmative.
Yes, sir,
the captain said faintly. Tseng could sympathize with his uncertainty in dealing with Zack Fair. He turned to his men and waved towards the truck.
You lot get in there. Get moving.
The truck jostled slightly under the thud of boots as the troopers boarded. Though there were now more bodies between Tseng and the 3 subjects of interest, it was obvious from the stiff way the men held themselves that they wouldn't do much to draw the attention of their superiors. A possible perk of riding with Sephiroth. Tseng noted that Connolly wasn't present among the other troopers. A missed opportunity. Well, there would be further chances to observe him later. He was less important in the scheme of things than the motives behind Zack and Cloud, and to a lesser extent Sephiroth's latest behavior. The captain trotted out of view, heading for the other truck. It wasn't long before the vehicle gave a low growl as the engine revved up. With a lurch and the crunch of snow under heavy-duty tires, they began to move. The ensuing silence was fraught with tension between the nervous troopers. Zack's restless twitching and Cloud's distracted stare. Though Tseng could understand Zack's discomfited attitude, he could not, with any certainty, say he understood Cloud's. It might have been best if Zack had not been assigned to the task because of his personal feelings in the previous failed mission. The conflict of interest made it unadvisable, but politics and necessity made it impossible. In the end, Zack had appeared pleased to take on the mission, when Tseng had informed the three of them in the soldier floor briefing room. Zack had said, "So long as I get to visit Asai and Sebastian's memorial afterwards. I'm not too happy with this plan, but I'll do it." There had been a faintly discontent set to his stance, with tension in his shoulders and a furrow in his brow. Cloud had been present, but his expression had been unreadable, beyond the slight frown as he looked to Zack. Sephiroth had said nothing in response to his assignment. Tseng hadn't expected him to. It may have been, as Renner would gleefully call it, overkill to bring Sephiroth to bear on such a mission. However, Fair has had several recent failures. This mission must succeed. When dealing with this group, we don't have room for errors. The undercurrent of Veld's words had been "not anymore," and "remember what we lost last time." Tseng could understand, even if he did harbour some warmth of friendship towards Zack. And Cloud, that was another political mess entirely. "Why send Cloud?" Lazard had asked. "He was kept out of it last time due to clearance level." Tseng had nodded and replied, "I'm sure you're aware that you are not alone in wanting to test his capability. There are more parties than yourself interested in seeing him succeed." Lazard had nodded, as if he wasn't surprised. He probably hadn't been. It was no real difficulty to guess that President Shinra himself had a personal interest in Cloud. After all, it wasn't every day anyone could make a stand against Shinra's prize soldier. Between the three of them, they had Shinra in tangles. Dealing with Sephiroth was nothing unusual, but adding Zack Fair and Cloud Strife to the occasion had been disconcerting. Certainly Zack was a well-known commodity these days, but he'd never been so problematic. They watched him for signs of discontent towards Shinra, or an inclination to follow in his mentor's footsteps, made sure he stayed loyal to Shinra, and made sure he didn't compromise the ancients. And now we're even more concerned about his allegiances because of Cloud. Tseng would rather he not have to pursue Zack in such a manner. It was an uneasy meeting of personal feeling and his job, one that he wished he'd never come up against. The entire situation was becoming more problematic at every turn.
"Hey, Cloud." Zack's voice cut through the silence. "Scoot over here a little more, would you? I'm still cold."
Tseng looked up to see he'd slouched down even further, his legs sprawled out and taking up a good deal of space. Cloud sent him a shadowed look, lips twisted into a faint frown, and one hand absently rubbing over his elbow in slow, circular motions.
"I know."
The tone of voice he used said that he'd known this for several long, aggravating hours, and probably since the day before.
"You were hogging all the blankets." "Don't give me that,"
Zack said with a faint huff.
"You said the cold didn't bother you."
There was a sharp rattle before the small window in the back of the cabin slid open.
"I heard that."
The voice was Connolly's.
"It's probably a good thing that Jack isn't here."
Zack gave a cough that was more of a laugh, while Cloud glared down at the bed of the truck.
"And I'm sure you won't go telling him either,"
Zack said breezily.
"You're too nice, right?"
"Right," Connolly said.
"But at least I get to ride up front where it's a bit warmer."
Ignoring Zack's sound of protest, Cloud's eyes flicked up to the little window, and he gave a soft snort of laughter.
"I think you've been spending too much time with Sparrow. That was downright mean, he said mildly. Sorry. You aren't at all, Zack began. Before he could get going, Tseng mused. You didn't complain this much during your last missions in the area. That's because I didn't have to spend the night, Zack said. Besides, how do you know I didn't complain last time? The Turk that accompanied you on the mission was very thorough in their report, Tseng replied, down to the nap you took before it. Zack, at least, had the decency to look sheepish. Hey, Zack said after a moment of silence, where there was only the sound of canvas, tires, and the engine. Did I tell you about the dream I had last night? Cloud groaned faintly. Yes, twice. Zack huffed. Oh, come on, it was hilarious. I bet Sephiroth wants to hear it. The grin on his face made it clear that they all most likely didn't want to hear it. Sephiroth blinked slowly, as if coming out of a trance, at the sound of his name. Smile turning innocent, Zack said, Right, Sephiroth? Sephiroth turned his head enough to give Zack a blank look. I wasn't listening. Of course not. Zack, Cloud muttered, sounding faintly pleading. Just drop it. My mom used to say that dreams have meaning, Connolly said wistfully. Said that they reflect the fears and worries in your life. That why you're always daydreaming? The driver's gruff voice muttered from the cabin. Connolly cleared his throat in embarrassment. Well, I doubt my dream reflected anything, Zack said dismissively. It was just weird. Cloud gave a faint sigh and dropped his head into his hands, resigned. See, I had a dream that I was at a Moogle dance party in a Moogle costume, and I was looking for someone I knew. So I see this huge cactor amongst all these little Moogles and think, that's gotta be a person too. Turns out I was right. It was Cloud, and he was really, really cranky. Next thing I know, we're starting talking about how awful Thornberrys are, and Sephiroth shows up in a black chocobo costume. Utter silence greeted that cheery proclamation. In their loose grip around Masamune's hilt, Sephiroth's fingers twitched. Tseng could even see his lips thin slightly. The sound of a fist hitting flesh broke the silence as Cloud punched Zack in the arm, and Zack gave a quiet "Ow!" Wryly, Tseng noted that the troopers with them were wisely resorting to incredulous, yet silent, gaping at their superiors. In a rustle of feathers, the chocobo rose to its feet, swaying slightly with the motion of the truck. The troopers opposite to it drew in a terrified breath as they shrank back into their seats. The bird ignored them as it shuffled forward a few paces. It settled down again at Zack's feet, its feathered head in Cloud's lap as it cooed plaintively. "Hey!" Zack complained. He shifted in his seat, one knee raising a few centimeters, but no further. "Go sit on Cloud's feet, bird brain." "I thought you said you were cold." Cloud griped, even as he busied his hands with scratching the bird's growing crest. "Isn't this warmer?" "Yeah, but I think my legs are already falling asleep." "What do you feed him, Sephiroth? Mako and growth hormones? He weighs a ton." Flatly, not even drawing his attention from the sky, Sephiroth said, "Muffins." Tseng almost raised an eyebrow in surprise when Cloud let out a huff of laughter. More and more interesting. It looked as though the three were growing closer. But when? He made a mental note to sick that task on Reno. At least he liked snooping around other people's private lives. Zack squirmed for a few more moments, but in the end had to concede that the chocobo wasn't going to give him any leg space at all. "If I can't walk when we're attacked by that slavering horde of fanatical rebels, I'm leaving all the fighting up to you," he griped, folding his arms over his chest. Sephiroth gave a non-committal hum, while Cloud's expression closed off. That was interesting. Well, it could be more of Cloud's tendency
to be as readable as a brick wall.
And as interesting,
as Renaud had proclaimed once. It was also possible he was reacting to an involuntary admission on Zach's part. Zach, who was huffing his irritation to the canvas roof, and Cloud, who was tuning out the rest of the world in his efforts to reduce Sephiroth's chocobo into a cooing pile of feathers. Tseng resisted the urge to rub his temples, or he was thinking too hard on it. He couldn't allow himself to fall into the trap of creating a conclusion without backing it up with solid evidence. That led to rumors and mistakes. Instead, he filed the observation away with the rest, to go over when he had a clearer head. Zach managed a whole 2 minutes of impatient silence, interdispersed with loud sighs and endless switching, before he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and glanced to the left and right of him.
So, what's your favorite thing, huh?
What? Cloud asked distractedly. He hadn't paused in his attention to Sephiroth's chocobo, smoothing down feathers and rubbing at the happy bird's beak, but he did turn his head to give Zach a bemused look. The only movement from Sephiroth was a slight sway in his hair as he tilted an ear towards Zach. But that was as good as proclaiming his rapt attention. Now that he had their interest again, Zach grinned and leaned back in his seat. With a heave, he freed his feet from underneath the chocobo, before using the bird as a footrest. The black chocobo warbled in annoyance as it craned its head around, nipping at Zach's pant leg in an affronted manner. Zach paid it no mind.
Your favorite thing? You know, sunsets over the water, ice cream on a hot day, walking around your house naked.
Zach ignored Cloud's exasperated nudge at his ribs, continuing blithely.
Or anything, really. Flowers, food, people.
Zach. The name was said in 2 very different voices, and 2 very different inflections. Zach grinned at the pair on either side of him. Cloud looked momentarily disturbed, though Sephiroth didn't seem at all perturbed. There was a choked-off sound from the trooper next to Tseng, who didn't seem to know if he ought to laugh or cry.
Come on, Zach wheedled. It's not that big of a deal.
Pointedly squeezing the sword's hilt again, Sephiroth said,
Masamune.
Zach shot him a look of pure exasperation, shaking his head ruefully.
That's not how it works.
Why not? Cloud asked absently.
Not you too. Man, you both are so boring.
Zach yelped, gesticulating wildly. Cloud ducked so the fist that was aimed at his head hit one of the metal bars on the truck with a rather loud thunk. Shaking his stinging fist, Zach continued.
You've got to have a favorite thing that doesn't involve weapons and stuff. I like a good training session, but I also like those delicious bagels the cafeteria gets every few weeks. My mom made a great stew,
Connolly piped up, sounding wistful again.
It wasn't really something we ate a lot back in Costa del Sol, so it was kind of special when we had it. Thank you,
Zach said, voice heavy with vexation.
You're my new favorite trooper. There's the shows in the small theater on Loveless Avenue.
One of the troopers directly across from Cloud piped up bravely.
The dancing ladies, you mean?
His neighbour said, ribbing the first trooper with an elbow. The first trooper hissed quietly as he shoved back, helmet twitching slightly in Sephiroth's direction. That silenced the heckler, though none of the other troopers were brave enough to break the uncomfortable silence. Zach didn't seem to notice the awkwardness.
I've never been to one of those dances.
Zach leaned back in his seat, bringing his hands up behind his head. His elbows were mere inches from his seat companions, and perhaps he could sense the impending doom as he lowered his arms a moment later to his lap.
Got dragged to Loveless once, though. Sorry, Sephiroth. And it was all right, I guess. I didn't really understand it.
I had a friend who said he saw it once.
Cloud muttered half-heartedly. Said he fell asleep through it. Perhaps that's for the best, Sephiroth mused, his low voice making the troopers jump. Tseng gave a faint cough that had little to do with the chilly air. I doubt we could survive you finding an interest in it. Hey! Zack yelped, looking sullen.
Silence descended again, Zack deciding to pick at his gloves in favor of further ribbing from the other two. Tseng took a moment to wonder how he would report this to the group interested in Cloud and Zack. Reno surely wouldn't enjoy being told that the most imminent danger from Zack was of him getting bored and going stir-crazy. He was reminded of the fact that Angeal Hewley had offhandedly referred to his student as a puppy. The imagery of tossing Zack a new toy to keep him from chewing up the furniture was inescapable. By the time they arrived at their destination, the restless, unpent energy filled the air with tension. Tseng was mostly immune to the atmosphere, though he continued to maintain a dislike of the bitterly cold weather that hadn't improved during their trip. Once the truck came to a stop, Sephiroth immediately disembarked, his boots crunching in the snow. He turned his head to look over one shoulder.
Miri, come.
At the command, the black chocobo rose to its feet, eliciting another group cringe from the troopers, and dumped Zack's legs off its back. Ignoring the startled yelp, the chocobo leapt lightly out of the truck after its departing master. Cloud's lips twitched into a brief frown at the bird's abrupt exit.
Hey, Sephiroth, wait!
Zack yelled, vaulting nimbly out of the truck himself.
Sheesh, just hold on a sec, would you?
Though he didn't look back, Sephiroth did stop. Around them the wind whistled and keened through the nearby rock formations. Tseng hung back to observe as Cloud slid quietly out to stand beside Zack, and the troopers filed out behind him. Zack hesitated, then reached out to ruffle Cloud's hair. He got a swat for his trouble, though it only made him laugh, and he tugged the strap of Cloud's harness in return.
Be careful, okay? This shouldn't take too long.
You worry too much, Cloud said softly, though the slight upturn of his lips took any sting out of the comment.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't have to if you didn't attract so much trouble.
That was a parting shot. Zack trotted over to join Sephiroth. The two turned to head alongside the truck, towards where Tseng knew from the reports on January's incident that a bridge had once spanned a gorge.
All right, men, fall in.
The barked order told Tseng's attention away, and he turned to watch the troopers fall into hasty but orderly lines. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see Cloud still staring after his friend, paying no attention to the bustle around him. When the red-scarfed officer's litany of orders finished, he then turned his attention to Cloud. He dithered for a moment before straightening his shoulders and marching over to clap Cloud on the shoulder. Tseng noted with interest that Cloud winced before turning a flat look on the captain. It had been Turk's luck, as they call it, that Cloud's old squad was assigned to this mission. Tseng was well aware that Turks made their own luck. While he couldn't watch overtly, he kept the pair in his peripheral while he scanned the camp, listening in to see how Cloud would react to his old commander. Unperturbed by Cloud's expression, the captain gave him a once-over, nodding to himself.
Strife, good to see you're still causing trouble. Least it's on soldier fairs time now.
If the captain was put off by Cloud's less than positive reaction, he didn't let on.
I'd like for you to stay here and provide backup where necessary,
he continued, tone somewhat between a suggestion and an order. He didn't seem sure of how to deal with Cloud, whether he should treat him with the deference owed a soldier, or as a member of Shinra's infantry. Cloud's unofficial status was putting his military training through the ringer. Cloud frowned slightly, but nodded. Understood. The captain gave another sharp nod, before turning away to stride towards the waiting infantryman. If his step was a bit too quick to be casual, only Tseng made a note of it.
"Mavis, Harrison,"
the captain said briskly.
"I want you two heading out."
Tseng tuned out the orders with careful ease, already well aware of their plan of action, and focused on Cloud. His restless gaze had returned to the vague direction that Zack and Sephiroth had gone. Tseng wondered at his preoccupation. Surely he knew as well as, if not better than, anyone that the two were well capable of taking care of themselves. Glancing around their impromptu base, Tseng walked back over to the trucks, suppressing a grimace at the cold seeping through his shoes. While he was still wearing the traditional Turk suit, he had given in to the inevitable and worn a pair of sturdy black boots. The ever-present chill of this continent was mitigated only slightly when he leaned against the side of the truck's hood. He could feel the heat from the engine working its way through his clothes. This mission was to be recon only. The troopers were stationed here only as backup, if Zack or Sephiroth called for them. Knowing the two of them as he did, that was unlikely. He could utilize the downtime, though, and continue his observations of Cloud. There was more to this mission than investigating Cloud and his conspirators, of course. Tseng wouldn't have come personally otherwise. But Sephiroth and Zack were to uncover if there was any further signs of Avalanche's presence in the area, and if so, to neutralize the problem. Tseng was there to make sure no more slip-ups happened, and so any sensitive material or evidence could be recovered. The fact that he could report back on Cloud for the soldier program and the President's interest was an opportunity that he had seized. He remained on alert. If it did turn out Avalanche was in the area, then a confrontation was likely. Taking a small notebook from his jacket pocket, he glanced up at the sound of boots. Connolly slowed his steps before giving Tseng a respectful nod and climbing into the truck's cab. He was apparently in charge of communications, as he began a well-rehearsed relay with the outgoing teams. Even better, it gave Tseng an opportunity to study him further. Cloud's former partner was interesting because of how little he stood out. Someone who'd worked with Cloud in the past, who'd been on that elusive mission to the mines and the ranch, yet somehow blended in with the rest of the army so well as to be forgettable. In Tseng's experience, that meant there was more to hide. If he turned out to be as boring as he made himself out to be, there was still valuable information to be had by his interaction with Cloud. If not, well, it was Tseng's job to find out, and deal with it appropriately. Ignoring Connolly's low voice, Tseng jotted down a few coded reminders before tucking his notebook away. From here, he could see most of the troopers as they set up a perimeter guard, while a few of them joined the captain at a rickety portable table over which were spread several maps, presumably of the icicle area. Cloud was still standing where he'd last been. Even as he took notice, Tseng saw Cloud give a sudden shake before he began walking towards the trucks. He didn't look in Tseng's direction, but ducked his chin lower into his scarf as he hopped up to sit on the back of the truck, letting his legs dangle off the flatbed. One hand worked under his knee pad, rubbing at the joint. Tseng closed his eyes, leaving the merest slits so he could still see movement, and turned his attention to the sounds around him. Cloud was the quiet shift of cloth in front of him. Connolly's voice mixed with the scratch of a pencil on paper as he worked inside the truck was just behind, and the echo of military efficiency surrounded the area in a ring of bustle and noise. The captain's burr of a voice snapped sharply through the air as he sent his men out, the young men responding in a clipped chorus of, "Yes, sir!" Though there was nothing alarming in the ambient noise, Tseng didn't relax. He was, after all, still on the job. The frenetic energy died away as the army dug in, waiting for the all clear and further orders from their leaders. Snow crunched under several pairs of boots, and Tseng watched from under his lashes as a few troopers meandered closer to the truck. The three-eyed red glow of their helmets was muted in the wintry light. Cloud looked up at their approach and let his hand slip out from under his knee pad. Had he suffered some sort of injury? Tseng made a mental note. If they were attacked, it would affect Cloud's efficiency.
Well, looks like Connolly wasn't entirely lying,
one of the troopers said to Cloud as an opening volley. The only reaction that got from Cloud was a raised eyebrow.
"Hey!"
came a mild protest from the truck. Connolly stood up on the running board so he could lean his arms on top of the open door and still listen for the radio.
"It's not my fault you didn't believe me."
The second trooper snorted derisively.
"Yeah, you know Connolly doesn't have a deceptive bone in his body."
He jammed his thumbs into his belt, his gun strap sliding a few inches on his shoulder as he settled into a relaxed stance.
"You gotta tell us what happened,"
the third newcomer broke in, leaning on the back of the flatbed and elbowing Cloud's leg. He'd shrugged off his gun entirely to lean it against the truck at his side.
"We saw you go down in the Mako. Had a whole eulogy planned for you, we did,"
the second trooper cut in.
"Yeah, then Soldier Fair got you out, but most of us got separated after that. Me and Kirk here were pinned down on the east side, so we missed half of the excitement in the morning."
His words were accompanied with a thumb jab in the second trooper's direction.
"What was it like?"
That came from the first trooper.
"The Mako, I mean. Anything like the soldiers say it is?" That's kind of insensitive, guys,"
Connolly pointed out. Kirk flashed a grin that was more teeth than mirth.
"I'm sure he doesn't mind, right, Cloud?" "Yeah, he's made of tough stuff,"
the third trooper added, the hint of a snicker in his voice.
"Or at least he used to think he was,"
Kirk challenged. Cloud's bland stare was their only answer. The efforts to heckle him seemed to be completely lost on him. The first trooper squatted down, the butt of his gun just brushing at the snow at his feet. His back was to Tseng, so all he could see under his lashes was the vague movements of the man's arms. Then the sound of a lighter went off, and a thin stream of smoke drifted up. Tseng came very close to letting out an inelegant snort of his own. Either the trooper didn't notice the fact of a Turk standing nearby, and judging by the half-alarmed look his fellows were giving him, he did know, or he didn't consider Tseng's authority to be worth worrying over.
"If Connolly is right, then he is tough stuff now,"
the trooper said. He exhaled a stream of smoke, the cigarette loosely clasped between his fingers. Kirk glanced around surreptitiously for his captain before squatting next to him. The cigarette was passed over without comment.
"I've heard from Dan in Squad 6 that he saw him fighting the General in person,"
the trooper that was still standing said. He'd turned so his back was against the flatbed, and had tilted his head back, so presumably he could see Cloud's face. It was hard to tell with the helmet.
"Did you seriously do that? Damn. Why do all the interesting things happen when I'm stuck elsewhere?"
The trooper kicked his boots petulantly, sending a clump of snow flying. It thumped dully against the grill of the truck Tseng was leaning against.
"Connolly said he fought the General right after his accident,"
the smoking trooper said, having reclaimed his cigarette. He flicked a bit of ash in aforementioned trooper's direction. Tseng was at the wrong angle to be able to see Connolly's face for reaction, if there was any.
"Do you have a death wish or something?"
the standing trooper asked, elbowing Cloud's leg again. It was mildly amusing to watch the troopers try to elicit a reaction from Cloud, yet not giving him a chance to respond. Cloud was a quiet sort, when he wasn't baiting Tseng's subordinates, that is. Perhaps that's what he was doing again, deliberately antagonizing his old squad mates. Records of him before the accident reported a surly youth with a chip on his shoulder. This didn't quite mesh with that personality, but Tseng could see the similarities. Kirk shook his head, idly rubbing a gloved hand across his mouth.
Soldiers say Mako can turn your head for a while, but I never heard them say it turns you absolutely insane. Hey, your eyes do glow now.
The non-sequitur came from the standing trooper, who had pushed his helmet up and leaned as far up on his toes as he could to peer into Cloud's face. Cloud leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing at the forward trooper. That seemed to be the last straw for Cloud. He stirred, giving the trooper a pointed look that had him backing off sheepishly. When he opened his mouth, Tseng wasn't the only one to still his breathing to hear the response. It was a reaction in himself that honestly surprised Tseng. Something in Cloud's reticence to speak made his words seem all the more poignant. "Who are you, anyway?" There was a moment of dumbfounded silence before Connolly let out a heartfelt groan. "Cloud!" That seemed to break the tension, and the other 3 troopers roared with laughter. Tseng frowned to himself. A joke, then? Was this Cloud's retaliation for the heckling? Or was it possible Cloud didn't recognize his old patrol? Mako did attack the mind. It was one of the reasons the selection for soldier was so rigorous. If you showed any signs of mental sickness or instability, or even if your personality wasn't compliant with the standard regulations, it was grounds for refusal to the program. Cloud had been refused for just that reason. Tseng couldn't decipher how much of Cloud's bafflement was honest at this point, so there was reason to wonder if his Mako bath had a serious mental effect on him. "Geez," the trooper standing next to Cloud said between chuckles. "A few months and you think you're big enough to forget your old buddies? You're not even out of our uniform yet." He plucked at the blue pant leg next to him in emphasis. The group tailed off into silence after that, the only sound coming from Connolly as he ducked back into the cab of the truck to send out another relay. Cloud's attention turned back to the direction Zack had left. The small furrow between his brow returned as he stared into the distance. Tseng was reminded of Sephiroth's tendency to do the same, though Cloud appeared to be focused on something in particular. He was looking at the sky, Tseng realized, but couldn't turn himself to see what had caught Cloud's eye. The 2 troopers on the ground finished off the cigarette, one taking the time to grind the butt into the snow before they stood up again.
"So,"
the smoker drawled, nodding once Cloud's attention returned to the group.
"Are you gonna be back in our squad eventually? Or do they plan to promote you into soldier?"
Kirk sighed.
"I hope he comes back. He's a bit of a brat, but we'd be the only squad with an enhanced operative."
When Cloud failed to answer, the trooper at his side said wistfully,
"You think maybe they'll start some special group for guys like him? What if there were more?" "I think that's called soldier, idiot,"
Kirk snapped at his partner. The trooper struck out with a fist to punch Kirk's shoulder.
"Shut up, jackass. You know what I meant."
"I hope there aren't more." Connolly perked up from the truck, having finished his last relay.
"It was Goddess's luck that Cloud survived it all, you know." "Listen to Connolly defend his hero," the smoker crooned mockingly. "That's the whole point of trying to get into soldier, isn't it? Dumping yourself in Mako is just a shortcut." "Hey, yeah, you want to be in soldier so bad. Why don't you give it a try?"
Kirk goofed, pointing a finger up to Connolly.
That's not really a good idea,"
Connolly said uncomfortably. "I mean, they choose who goes into soldier for a reason."
Lighten up,"
Kirk said dismissively.
"Like you'd have the balls to do it anyway."
"Connolly." Cloud's unexpected interruption caused all 4 troopers to look at him, and Tseng had to push down the desire to do the same.
Yeah?"
Connolly asked hesitantly. Cloud's attention remained locked on the sky for a second longer, before he twisted to face Connolly fully. "Have Gibbs and Edge contacted you recently?" Ah, those names were familiar. Gibbs especially. Cisne's report had mentioned the third had come to Cloud's aid in the skirmish in the slums. Like Connolly, both had been on the team of the Medial mission that had hosted Cloud's accident, as well as the mines mission afterwards.
Not since a few months ago. And they're thirds, and they probably don't have a lot of time or anything.
Connolly's voice turned into a mumble. Cloud nodded once in acknowledgement.
We should spar again sometime,
he said simply. The other 3 troopers were staring between the two in varying degrees of surprise.
Maybe we won't get interrupted this time.
Connolly's voice was perkier, a touch of humour in the tone.
You were doing fine against Sephiroth,
Cloud said blandly.
Hey, what the hell?
The smoking trooper blurted out, stalking towards Connolly.
What's he on about? When did... Sorry, Wade, I gotta check in with the patrols now,
Connolly said quickly, ducking back into the truck. There was a clatter of equipment as he picked up the radio.
Bullshit,
Wade swore, kicking at the side of the truck in aggravation.
You just did that. Why didn't you tell us you were so buddy-buddy with a couple of soldiers, eh? And what's this about the general?
I'm good at keeping secrets, was Connolly's quiet reply. Tseng dearly wished he could see Connolly's face. That mission alone was more intriguing than Cloud's behaviour. He made a mental note to go over the background check on Connolly again, with an eye to how long he'd been partnered with Cloud, and possible meetings they may have had before being stationed on the same squad. Cloud attracted the most interesting people. Connolly did dutifully begin his radio relay, despite Wade's annoyed mutters. Tseng returned his attention to Cloud, who had gone back to staring off into the distance. Despite his outward focus, there was a slight upturn of his mouth as he looked rather smug. So it had been deliberate? How much of it was solidarity with his friend against the mild bullying? How much was the show to put on for Tseng? He had to assume Cloud was aware what the presence of a Turk meant for him. That they were interested was no secret.
You're not going to tell, are you?
Kirk said shrewdly, crossing his arms and frowning at Cloud.
No,
came the simple reply. Kirk snorted, shaking his head in disgust.
Forget coming back to our patrol. We don't need a brat like you around to annoy the living shit out of me.
I'm crushed, Cloud said absently. He was rubbing his hands against his opposite elbow now. More injuries? As far as Tseng knew, Cloud hadn't been on any missions recently that could have resulted in lasting injury for an enhanced person. Whatever had caused the discomfort was enough for Cloud to make an outward show of it, though it seemed to be more of a subconscious reaction than deliberate. A product of an off-duty activity? Renault had captured proof that Sephiroth and Cloud engaged in spars in their downtime. They kept it off the recording equipment as well. Again, not unheard of, but Tseng wasn't about to discount the possibility that they interacted a lot more than was publicly known. He made another mental note to request automatic recordings of all training room activity. He wasn't likely to get it, since the scientists were very proprietary about their footage and who had access to it.
Shit, Captain's on his way,
Wade hissed, suddenly at Kirk's side. The trooper next to Cloud immediately scooped up his gun and shouldered it, and all 3 disappeared around the opposite corner of the truck without another word. A moment later, the red-scarfed captain approached. He hesitated a moment as he came level with Tseng, before apparently deciding to take the side of discretion as he sent the Turk a brief salute. Without opening his eyes, Tseng nodded in acknowledgement, amused when the officer started guiltily. To cover his discomfort, the captain turned to the open door, waiting for Connolly to pause between calls.
What's the status of the patrols, Wilhelm?
He asked gruffly, worrying the edge of his scarf between 2 fingers.
Sir, Patrols 1, 3, and 4 have all reported back all clear. Patrol 2 is waiting for my response now.
Connolly said immediately as he snapped a salute with his free hand.
Good, good. Keep on them. We need to be prepared to move when the soldiers order us to.
The captain nodded once, more to himself than the at-attention Connolly, before he turned and moved past Singh to approach Cloud. A lone eyebrow crept up his face as he took note of the ground-out cigarette butt, and he snorted.
Cheeky bastards,
he griped. Turning his attention up, he added,
Strife?
If the troopers had left Cloud bemused, the effect the captain had on him was magnified. He appeared torn about the hierarchy of the situation, and leaned forward as if to slide off the back of the truck before the captain waved him off.
Don't bother. You probably outrank me, or will soon anyway,
he said gruffly. Cloud said nothing in response. To cover the moment of awkward silence, the captain cleared his throat and scanned the camp again, nodding absently to himself at the organized bustle. Somewhat foolishly, he made another attempt to fill the pause.
You know anything about this mission I should be aware of?
Cloud blinked slowly, the frown on his face deepening slightly.
No.
The silence descended again, only to be broken as the captain let out a snort of laughter.
You never were much of a talker, were you?
He said with a rueful grin. Singh was mildly surprised when Cloud returned that with a faint smile.
No, sir.
He tilted his head, regarding the captain for another beat or two before adding,
As far as I know, this mission is a routine check. No resistance expected.
That got another snort from the captain.
Expected, right. Well, orders are orders.
The sound of Connolly's voice cut suddenly through Cloud's hum of a reply. His voice raised, with a thin thread of tension running through it. The captain turned around as Cloud straightened in his seat, both paying close attention.
Mavis, Harrison, come in. This is base. Answer your damn radio, guys.
The last bit wasn't military protocol, but carrying the troopers' irritation and worry. Singh stopped his pretense of not paying attention and straightened, preparing for trouble. However, a moment later, there was a crackle from the radio and the faint sound of swearing from the other end. The captain moved back over by the door to hear better as Connolly took up the call again in relief.
Mavis, Harrison, this is base. Is everything all clear?
This is Mavis,
a rough voice replied.
We haven't spotted any signs of life, let alone humans out in this forsaken, cold-as-tits place.
What the heck? What took so long to answer?
Connolly censored himself and got an amused snort from the captain for the effort.
Damn cliff tried to bury us in a shitload of snow,
Mavis said.
Harrison went under, but no injuries. It was...
The trooper's voice cut off abruptly, leaving only the crackle of static behind.
Hey, Mavis! Mavis! Respond, Mavis!
Connolly yelped, reaching out and clutching the radio with his free hand. Cloud had stood up and was looking off in the distance, not towards Zach's departure point, but off across the camp, where a commotion was beginning. The captain didn't even wait for the confirmation that they were under attack.
Wilhelm, get those patrols back. We are under attack. Get to your positions.
The last part was bellowed to the camp at large. It was a shockingly loud sound for a human being to make, but was something most drill sergeant types could master effortlessly. Singh drew his gun from inside his coat and followed after the captain as he dashed for the sound of gunfire echoing in the wintry air. Cloud was a presence at his side, keeping pace with his sword already drawn. His face was calm, mouth set in a determined line. Singh wondered how much of it was real and how much was bravado. Though Cloud had had a good share of real combat experience, most of his recorded missions, after his accident, had been routine monster removal. Zach's teaching skills were about to get their first field test. Assuming he had a chance to later, Singh might even tease him about that. Shouts were going up all over camp, which had come to life like a disturbed insect nest. The flow of movement was all towards the site of the attack, though Singh was pleased to note not all soldiers had moved. There was a secure perimeter. If this attack proved to be a feint, they would still have a line of defense. As he drew nearer the commotion, Tseng felt his stomach drop. There was only a single attacker clad in dark, feature-concealing clothes, not the large group of Avalanche members he'd anticipated. The man was running inexorably forward, his large sword held casually in one hand, and appeared to flicker from place to place as he dodged the bullets that rent the air. A raven, then. He'd hoped that the unknown and dangerous Avalanche operatives were too few and precious to waste on remote posts such as this. Obviously not. That, or information had leaked on who was leading this mission. Perhaps Avalanche hoped to test the new advances of their pet project against Shinra's best. Who knew what advances they'd made with the information they'd captured? If they'd managed to crack the code on the disk, that is. Professor Rayleigh, the scientist in charge of the information on the disk, had been sure it could not be hacked. The dull gleam of the Raven's sword caught the light as he took a trooper trying to flee for safety, and Tseng wrote the soldier off as dead even before the swing began. There was a blur on his left, and then the loud clang of metal on metal rang through the air. Cloud was suddenly there, between the trooper and the intruder, blocking the sword strike with his own. Soldier speed. Tseng had witnessed Cloud move that fast once before, when the Wutai sniper had been aiming for Zack. At the time, Tseng hadn't felt it worth mentioning that if Cloud hadn't have moved when he had, Gunn had a shot lined up to take the spy out. It did, however, highlight the fact that Cloud was less likely to hold back when he was protecting someone. A sneer of surprise flashed across the Raven's face before Cloud shoved him back. The trooper Cloud had protected scrambled away while Cloud leapt backwards out of range as well. That was sensible, if baffling. Thanks to Shotgun's report, Tseng knew Cloud had fought a Raven before. Was Cloud so easily able to identify it? Hence his retreat from the dangerous Avalanche operative. Or, as Tseng was beginning to suspect, were his memories unclear and the retreat a tactical move to observe before committing to combat? That was equally unlikely. Both Cloud and his mentor were the type to charge in recklessly, uncaring of the odds. Was he holding back because of Tseng's presence? If he was trying to hide the extent of his abilities, to what purpose? Especially as it was far too late for subterfuge on that front. They had multiple records of Cloud's level of ability. Most notably, of course, were his interactions against Sephiroth. Cloud's interference had stopped the Raven's advance, and he was quickly encircled by the Shinra troopers. Gunfire crackled through the air as the troopers worked with militant efficiency to subdue the attacker. Soldiers may have pure power, but the normal operatives made up for the lack, with their captains adapting strategies, partial to the large numbers at their disposal. Though the intruder was circled, each group of troopers had spaced themselves so they had a clear shot across without the fear of hitting their fellows opposite. The maneuver was in vain, however, as the Raven used his incredible speed, or could it be time magic aiding his movements, to avoid the bullets. Those he couldn't or didn't dodge were buffeted with his sword. There was a horrible screeching as the bullets scraped across the blade. The shrapnel of the shot went flying into the troopers, several of them staggering from the ricochets. Tseng had paused far enough back that he was out of range. The Ravens were still mostly an unknown quantity. Their best intel on them was from Shotgun's run-in. They were known to have advanced speed and strength, and apparently immortality. More recently, it had come to light that anyone could be changed. Tseng could still remember Zack's pained grin when he'd mentioned the names of the 2/3 who'd been taken over. It begged the question as to how Avalanche was able to control the agents enough to turn them against former friends. Their perceived lack of humanity wasn't enough cause, and it was a mystery what caused them to follow orders against their nature. It had spiked an interest in the science department. There was a blanket order to capture one of these enhanced operatives alive if possible. Since the intruder appeared to be working alone, this was an opportunity to accomplish that. It would have been no trouble if Sephiroth and Zack were here. As it stood, Tsing wondered if the troopers and Cloud would be enough. Shotgun had said that her namesake's weapon capacity to send out a wide spray attack had been key in her ability to defend and damage the Raven. The troopers may be able to effect a similar attack pattern, though without direction they would not be able to regroup fast enough to apprehend the Raven. That was what Turks were good at, making decisions on the fly and efficiently taking out their targets. Tsing could only rely on himself. To be honest, he wasn't confident that here, away from home territory, he could win against the enhanced operative. Shotgun had had that on her side as well. The captain bellowed an order to retreat and regroup, to which the men were sluggishly responding. A few were helping the injured move, while their fellows covered them with more ineffectual gunfire. In the chaos of the retreat, Tsing strode forward and levelled his gun at the intruder's back. It was deliberately fortuitous that he was in such a strategic position. He'd angled his advance to the outskirts of the camp for just this chance. With the advice of his subordinates in the back of his mind, Tsing carefully aimed and fired 2 rapid shots to either side of the intruder. His gun didn't have the spread of shotguns, but he was a much faster shot, and the 2 had sounded as one. When the intruder moved out of the way of the first shot, it would be right into the path of the other. He had underestimated their opponent's abilities. The Raven abruptly wasn't there anymore, seemed to vanish from sight as he dodged the bullets. The next thing Tsing knew, he was right in front of him, a malicious smirk twisting his features. Tsing managed to take a single step back before he felt the pummel of a sword in his gut. The force of the blow lifted him off his feet, though the power behind it was dulled by his quick retreat, and he was sent flying into a nearby snowbank. The wind was knocked out of him, and his stomach ached, but all he could feel was irritation at the indignity of being buried under a foot of snow. That speed was much greater than what they had recorded on Ravens. The disk that had contained sensitive information about the soldier program was lost to Avalanche during Shotgun's failed mission. So then, despite Professor Rayleigh's assurances, Avalanche had managed to break the security around the information and implemented it into their Raven program. It was the logical explanation for the sudden jump in skill. Tsing weighed his options of escaping now, with the balance of power leaning heavily in the Raven's direction. Their mission here may very well be compromised already. Without the backup of Sephiroth or Zack, the camp could be decimated. He had to decide now if he should abandon the troops to their fate, or trust in Zack and Sephiroth's ability to return in time to apprehend the Raven. Pulling himself out of the snowbank, and blinking moisture out of his eyes, Tsing's attention was drawn back to the intruder at the sound of swords clashing. Cloud had engaged again to repel the Raven's advance. Tsing hadn't forgotten the advantage he brought to their side. However, there was too much unknown to rely on him. If he was indeed on par with Sephiroth, no, that was an impossibility. More believably, if Cloud was able to keep up with Sephiroth, even for a short amount of time, then there was a chance to apprehend the Raven. Slim hope, what with the way Cloud was sticking to preventing the Raven from advancing further into the camp, instead of pushing his advantage. The tactic was invoking visible frustration in the Raven. His face was twisted in a snarl as he and Cloud exchanged blows, but both combatants made no other noises except for the sound of their blades meeting. The silence was eerie. Around them, the troopers seemed frozen, captivated by the incongruousness of the short, slim form of Cloud standing toe-to-toe with the larger, dark-clothed Raven. Cloud's brow was creased, the only sign of distress as he fought. Tseng would have expected more of a reaction. Despite knowing how close to soldier levels he was in terms of strength, and despite how stoic he was normally, it seemed incongruous for the speed of the battle at hand. However, there was something about this that was unsettling. It looked less like he was paying attention to the fight, and more like he was responding automatically. Tseng saw the moment Cloud's attention wavered. The Raven saw it too, and wasted no time in lashing out. Their swords met with a horrific screech of metal, the angle all wrong, and with a sharp snap, Cloud's sword shattered in two. Without pause, the Raven kicked out and caught the off-balanced Cloud full on the chest, sending him sliding across the ground near Tseng's position. It didn't appear to faze Cloud as he rolled to his feet immediately. However, instead of moving forward again, he stood with his broken sword hanging listlessly at his side, unmoving. Tseng realized with alarm that Cloud's eyes were unfocused, brow creased with confusion, not anger or calculation. He looked dazed. He had acted injured before, so it was possible that he wasn't able to fight the Raven evenly. Or he was suffering residual effects of his Mako accident. Tseng's fears were magnified when Cloud's free hand went up to clutch at his hair. His eyes locked on the Raven. The Raven, apparently satisfied Cloud wasn't a threat at the moment, turned his attention back to the camp at large. That set off a flurry of movement as troopers scrambled for safety amid the sound of renewed gunfire. How there weren't more casualties due to frantic friendly fire was something Tseng would puzzle over later. Now he approached Cloud's side, being careful not to startle him. If Cloud wasn't in his right mind for any reason, it was possible he would lash out, even against an ally. He was close enough that he heard Cloud's quiet mumble over the chaos of the camp. I will protect. With a groan, Cloud collapsed to his knees. His sword hit the snow as both hands clutched at his head, and Tseng took an abortive step towards him. Around them, the screams began.
The air was sharp with the scent of cold and ice, the breeze stiff enough to tug at Sephiroth's hair and send his coat rustling around his legs. All around them the land stretched on, white and bright, and covered in a swirling dance of lazy snowflakes. He blinked a few of the clinging, melting fragments of ice from his lashes and refocused his attention on Zack's back. Against the too white backdrop, Zack's clothes were a dark, inky splotch, his movements rangy as he strode forward. His every step was oddly quiet, just the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots instead of the usual loud tread. Sephiroth could not help but think he looked out of place, like a wolf displaced from its forest into this snowy tundra. Cloud fit this chilly world better, though that thought might have been because of his faint knowledge of the pair's backgrounds colouring his perception. He wondered where he fit in the scheme of his musings. Veery trotted ahead of them as he chased swirling eddies of snowfall, leaving behind a line of three-toed tracks that zigzagged their own path. The chocobo turned to look at him before he came tearing back across the intervening space with a cheerful warble. He circled around Sephiroth to fall into step, as he had many times before. He was close enough that Sephiroth could feel him bumping lightly against his coat. Absently, Sephiroth settled a hand on Veery's immature crest. He got a coo in response before the bird picked his pace up again and went to nip at Zack's hand.
"Hey there, fuzzball," Zack said. "At least you seem to be enjoying this trip."
With a tumbling chortle, Veery galloped further ahead,
and Zack slowed until Sephiroth came to a stop beside him. Zack exhaled, his breath coming out in a long, visible cloud. His brows were furrowed against the glare of their surroundings. He squinted towards the horizon line, where distant cliff walls and mountains formed. Off in other directions, there were other rocky promontories that surrounded them.
We're almost there. You can see a line up there where the snow gets all jagged and uneven.
Sephiroth looked to where Fury was silhouetted against the snowy backdrop, small wings flapping as he jumped to try and catch snowflakes. Beyond him, the snow sloped gently upward and turned into ridges and jagged peaks, though none of it was high enough to be considered mountainous. It was either a field of snow-covered rocks or the destroyed base they were looking for.
Come on, let's get this over with,
Zack muttered, and started forward again. Sephiroth followed him a few paces behind.
The sooner we can get this done, the better.
You have been uneasy about this from the beginning.
Yeah, I lost a whole team up here in January. And last year in Modierheim. Plus it's cold up here. And the further out we go, the colder it gets.
Zack attempted to end on a joke, to turn attention from the serious look that had been on his face since they'd left the others behind, fell flat. Sephiroth didn't bother to comment. No matter his own feelings about Modierheim, and maybe a quiet, secret wish he'd recently discovered, a wish that he'd been there at the end, he had no want to dwell on them now. He was, in a way, coming to accept the feelings of loss that they had left him with. The feelings of betrayal were still bitter and ashy in his mouth, but the knowledge that he should have done more remained with him after Zack's impromptu apology. Sephiroth, with all of his power, was the one to have failed here. A sudden shrill walk of surprise shattered the windy quiet. Sephiroth jerked his head up and swept his gaze across the snowy landscape ahead of them in search of Fury. The chocobo was already turning and running back towards them full pelt, wings spread for extra balance, as the snowy bank behind him erupted upward in a powdery shower. A sound like wind keening through high mountain passes rose as at least a dozen scaled, yellow and blue bodies used their membrane wings to grab for height, narrow heads craning towards them. From behind, another chorus joined the cry as Zack yanked Buster Sword from his back. Fury skidded to a halt at Sephiroth's side with a faint warble, turned, then crouched with his wings spread and his beak open in a threatening hiss. Calmly, Sephiroth slashed Masamune through the air, readying the blade. An unusually large flock for lesser lowploth. Zack snorted and swished the Buster Sword through the air once before grabbing the hilt in both hands and leveling it towards the oncoming monsters. The beasts crested the rise, tilting their wings, and dove downwards to come skimming towards them, low to the ground. The edges of their wings glowed blue-white, heralding an avalanche of snow that only grew as they covered the distance. Over the growing rumble, Zack said,
"Is that all you can say? You sound like we're here to research them."
Merely an observation," Sephiroth replied.
"They must have noted frequent traffic in the area and set up an ambush."
With a sharp motion, Zack freed a hand and shoved it into one of his pockets. A split second later it came out, a gleaming yellow materia sphere, in his clutches, and Zack jammed it into one of the Buster Sword's free slots.
"Then they picked the wrong people to ambush,"
he hollered over the glowing clamour. He lunged forward in a full-out run towards the oncoming wave of snow. Sephiroth smirked, gathering himself, and leapt upward. Below him, Zack skidded to a halt, boots kicking up a flurry of snow as he hauled Buster's sword back in one hand, his other arm thrown out for balance. A golden halo edged the massive blade as the materia he had added sparked. For several seconds he held the pose as the avalanche bore down on him. When it was no more than a few feet from engulfing him, he heaved Buster's sword forward. Even as Sephiroth fell and brought Masamune forward in a singing, flashing arc, an explosion ripped through the air in a swirl of released power and fire. The shockwave knocked aside snow and monsters alike, while the heat ate at them. Sephiroth landed before the second wave of monsters in a crouch, hair fluttering wildly around him from a mixture of his own momentum and the inferno at his back. He twisted Masamune in his hands and brought the blade up in an arc that clove several of the beasts in two. The rest of the monsters scattered, swirling away nimbly with quick wing beats. The snow stirred from their passing, his hair whipping up as they dove too close. Sephiroth stepped once, twice, and brought Masamune flashing up to deter the sweep of Elessiloploth's thumb claw. He turned the block into a punishing slash that easily removed the wing from the beast's body. The monster fell to the ground in a screeching, keening tangle. Behind him, the quick patter of chocobo talons through snow could be heard. "Viri, attack!" Without pausing, the chocobo warbled and lunged for the downed Lessiloploth. In seconds, Viri had taken hold of the dragon-like creature's thin neck in his beak and sunk his large, deadly claws into the beast's tender underbelly. Sephiroth turned, eyes fluttering closed briefly as he caught another attack on Masamune's blade. The icy chill of the air bit at his face. This close, he could see his breath misting on his sword. The Lessiloploth's talons were wrapped around it, bleeding as the honed edge cut into its flesh. Sephiroth gazed up into beady eyes, set in a narrow head. In a single harsh movement, he shoved upwards, heaving the beast away from him before its stinger could find itself lodged in his stomach. He brought his right hand up, wisps of fire igniting around his fingertips and gathering quickly as the spell came to life. Before the Lessiloploth could right itself and escape, Sephiroth unleashed the spell. There was a roar of flame and heat, and the monster screamed as it fell to the snowy ground in a surge of fire, smoke, and the acrid stink of burning flesh. With a single step and a twist, Sephiroth turned away and brought Masamune up to slash a monster from the air. Another turn, and he caught an oncoming stinger against one shoulder guard where, seconds before, it could have found itself lodged in his throat. In a flash of steel, he'd removed the beast's tail with a sharp swipe of his sword. A flick of the blade removed its head, and the body crashed to the ground. With a heavy thump, Zack landed a few feet away, Buster's sword held easily in a two-hand grip. He was all loose limbs, hunched shoulders, and legs spread for balance. Snow clung to his clothes, melting in clumps and splashes across the black material of his uniform and damp hair. Sephiroth vaguely wondered how he managed to look like he'd been fighting the snow rather than the monsters. He was answered a second later when Zack propelled himself forward into a nimble roll that brought him up behind the Lessiloploth that had just swung its tail at him. With a sharp crack, Zack smashed the beast into the snow. Eyes narrowed slightly, Sephiroth said, "Viri." With a sharp walk, Viri trotted over to give him a look from one beady eye. Sephiroth jerked his chin towards Zack's downed monster. Zack's brow shot up in surprise as the chocobo pounced on the monster in a flurry of claws and beak. Before he could say anything, Sephiroth leveled Masamune at him and lunged forward. To Sephiroth's silent surprise, Zack ducked under Masamune's blade, even as it was raised to avoid hitting him. Masamune cut into the yellow-colored underbelly of the monster that had been about to attack Zack's back. Zack gave a surprised yelp, then followed the sound up with a thump as he hit the ground. Sephiroth glanced back to see him clutching his head with one hand. Zack rolled his head back and gave him an affronted look. "You could have just warned me, you know." Veery gave a happy chortle as he edged around Zack to stand at Sephiroth's side. Zack vaulted back to his feet. He's improving. The thought, while unbidden, was inevitably true. The last time he'd seen Zack in combat, he hadn't been capable of thinking along the same pathways as Sephiroth, let alone keeping up with him. Sephiroth hadn't expected him to either. That he could now was disquieting, and Sephiroth wondered if it had anything to do with Cloud's strife. Everything seemed to inevitably come back to that strange boy.
"Why aren't they attacking anymore?"
Zack asked suddenly, sounding frustrated. He was standing behind Sephiroth, close enough that he could feel Zack's body heat warming the small space between them. Sephiroth's eyes tracked the monsters as they whirled around them, some spiral clockwise, others counterclockwise. The lazy snowfall was thickening, and the slow swirling eddies were becoming gusts. The air was chilling more until the exposed flesh of Sephiroth's chest, neck, and face felt as if they were burning. Zack made an uncomfortable sound at the back of his throat and shifted. All around them, the Lesser-Lopoth continued to fly, keening their uncanny cries. Veery gave a low-sounding warble and stumbled around in front of Sephiroth to press against his legs. With another soft queh, Veery shoved his head under the trailing edge of his coat and stood there shivering and cooing. Sephiroth narrowed his eyes at the monsters. A sharp difference in sound pierced the air. It was only the barest change between the rough sound of the wind and the cacophony of the Lesser-Lopoth. "Zack," he said. "Yeah?" "Consider yourself warned." Sephiroth crouched down and looped his arm under Veery's keelbone, then kicked off in a quick jump that left the chocobo squalling in surprise. It had been a while since Sephiroth had bothered to pick him up. Behind him, he heard Zack give a yell just before there was a sudden shower of icy shrapnel pelting the ground. Sephiroth angled Masamune up so that the long blade wouldn't catch on the ground just before his boots hit the powdery snow again. He had to slide one leg out further to catch his balance, hair flying around him in an obscuring flurry. Veery gave another squawk when Sephiroth released his grip on him and dropped him to the ground. Ignoring the bird, Sephiroth turned and gave Masamune a flick that made the hilt clack faintly. Zack knelt across from him. Between them was an array of large icicles impaled into the ground. The snow was still kicking up, and within seconds it was bad enough that Zack was only a dark-hued blur. Even as Sephiroth watched, movement suggested Zack was forced to lurch to his feet and jump backwards to avoid another salvo of falling ice. "Sephiroth!" Zack yelled, voice barely cutting through the rising blizzard. "It's a snow!" Snows, Shiva's daughters, as the locals sometimes called them. Frozen spirits that took the form of lovely young women. Some were benevolent to travelers, helping them when they were trapped in the blizzards and cold of snowfields and mountains. Others... Sephiroth pressed a hand against Veery's back until the chocobo complied and sank to the ground. "Stay," he commanded firmly. He would have to hope that the blizzard was bad enough that the Lesser-Lopoth wouldn't be able to find the young bird. He could still hear them, even if he could no longer see the beasts. The rustle of their wings as they passed by overhead, and the occasional sharp, keening cry that rose above the wind. Sephiroth rose and caught sight of Zack as he dove under another attack. The snow crunched beneath Sephiroth's boots as he closed the distance between them. Zack sent him a short look, his expression a grimace, and readjusted his grip on the hilt of his sword. "I just saw her," Zack said, "but before I could get to her..." Through the grey-white haze of the snowstorm, another volley of ice appeared, lancing towards them from shockingly close proximity. Beside him, Zack took a couple of sudden steps forward, boots crashing through the snow, and yanked the Buster Sword around in front of him as if it were a shield. He braced one hand against the flat of the blade, steadying his stance. There was a resounding clash as the icicle slammed into the blade, and Zack's body jerked slightly, before he whirled the blade back into an attack position and began charging. Sephiroth matched, then outstripped him as another attack came in. He swept them aside with a swipe of Masamune. There she was, ahead of them, through the blinding, swirling snow. Blue skin, silver blue hair, and deep blue, sheer fabric wrapped around her in an inexact famicile of clothing. Zack caught up with him, took a few more steps, then kicked off into the air, sword raised over his head. The snow swayed out of the way as he fell, leaving Zack's attack to cleave empty air. Sephiroth brought Masamune sweeping towards her, the long blade slicing a neat gash through the snow. She swayed away from the quick strike, and the two he followed up with. The snow smiled, coy and seductive, and lifted her hand. Wisps of blue magic flowed around her fingers and palms, the air crackling with chill. From behind him, Zack's voice carried over the whipping wind. "Sephiroth, I got this!" Sephiroth twisted aside at the heavy sound of a footfall, out of the sweep of Buster Sword, and Zack used the large blade to sweep aside the icy attack. He slanted Zack a look as the snow pouted at them. "You're eager." "Hey," Zack said cheerfully. "It's not every day a guy gets to fight side by side with the great Sephiroth. The last time didn't go so well, so I have to make up for it." Sephiroth huffed in faint amusement, and Zack lunged forward again. His technique was unwieldy, Sephiroth noted dispassionately, though it could be a side effect from the way he seemed to favor using the flat side or the blunt edge of the blade. The snow gave an angry sound, her smile turning coquettish a moment later, before she twirled around one of Zack's heavy attacks. She gave a soft croon and beckoned him with her fingers, eyes half-lidded. The entirety of the snowstorm sounded like it echoed with her call. Zack laughed, wild and reckless. "Sorry, babe. I got a wonderful girl waiting for me back home." The snow's face twisted up at the rejection, and as Zack made a hasty lunge, she ducked down. In an explosion of crackling, glassy sounds, the snow hardened, freezing over. Zack's feet went out from under him, and he landed on his back hard, with a pronounced "Youch!" Sephiroth strode forward, stepping over his prone form, and readied Masamune again. "I believe this is what Angeal called losing focus," he commented idly. All he got in response was a groan. The snow straightened and smiled prettily at him. Sephiroth let out a breath that misted in the air. "Don't even bother," Zack called from behind him. "He's colder than you are." Sephiroth slanted another glance back, bewildered at Zack's flippant treatment of the situation. One simply did not talk to monsters. Dismissing it as irrelevant, he lunged forward. The snow gasped sharply. Her steps danced-like as she twisted away from Masamune's flicking slices. He matched her step for step, eyes narrowed in calculation. Then he turned his blade into another swipe, putting a little more speed into his attack, and caught her as she moved to sway away, scoring from her hip along her abdomen. She shrieked, an unearthly, inhuman sound that was echoed by the keening voices of the lesser Laploth, still circling the area unseen. Her hand shot out and grabbed Masamune's blade. Frost immediately bloomed all across the metal, creeping towards the hilt and his hand. The snow bared her teeth in a silent snarl, and Sephiroth narrowed his eyes. Clearly he'd toyed with his battle long enough. It was time to... "Hey, Sephiroth, watch out!" A sudden, shocking, and unnatural silence followed Zack's shout. Even the falling snow seemed to stand still. Sephiroth yanked Masamune free from the snow's grip and turned towards Zack, just as he thrust his arm in the air. A glowing materia burned in the loose cradle of Zack's fist, from which a swirl of red-dyed magic shot towards the obscured sky. Seconds later, a heady pulse of power ripped outward like a warm breeze, blowing aside the snow like a curtain and rustling through Sephiroth's hair and coat. The cloudy sky swirled and boiled above them before bulging downwards. From it dropped a fiery form, all blistering red-brown skin with flames peeling back and long backward-curving horns. Sephiroth darted away from the epicenter of the battlefield, cutting across towards Zack in a wide arc, though his eyes never left Ifrit as the summon landed heavily. As soon as Ifrit's hooves hit the snowy ground, a hiss and a great bellow of steam went up. Sephiroth slid to a stop beside Zack and said, "This was hardly necessary." "It's overkill," Zack agreed flatly, "but we need to get moving." He grimaced and brushed at the clinging snow on the front of his shirt. "Soldiers or not, we're still susceptible to hypothermia and frostbite." Sephiroth gave a faint hum, though the sound was lost as the infernal beast tossed his head back, spread his clawed hands, and unleashed a torrent of fire that sent more steam curling into the air until it obscured his vision. Over the crackle of flames, he could hear the screams of the snow and the lesser Laploth. It went on for several seconds before Zack ended the spell, and the massive shadowy form, looming in the midst of the steam, faded away. A hush fell in the wake of the attack. The only sound came from Zack at his side when he moved to tuck the materia away. As the wind picked up and cleared away the steam, it revealed that Ifrit had melted the snow down several feet to form a sort of crater. A small pool of water had formed at the center of the bowl, and would, Sephiroth assumed, freeze over quickly. A few remaining lesser Laploth keened pitifully overhead, then turned their wings to fly away. Silently, Sephiroth pulled the chocobo lure he kept in his pocket out and activated it. Almost immediately, there was a sharp chirp, and Veery appeared on the far side of the snowy crater. With the instinctual, sure-footedness of his breed, the chocobo slid down the side, splashed through the small puddle at the center, and came tumbling up to them. His dark beak was still blood-stained, as were his claws, though it was drying now. Zack gave Veery a long look as Sephiroth tucked the now dark materia away. "I can't believe you taught him to take on monsters," Zack said, sounding flabbergasted. "No, wait, actually, I think I can." Sephiroth shot him a blank look. Zack threw one hand up in the air and turned to start walking away as he shouldered Buster Sword. Sephiroth heard him mutter, "Cloud gives me that same look." Bemused, Sephiroth gave Masamune a flick to remove as much of the clinging gore as possible, then turned and followed after him, Veery trotting happily at his heels. He couldn't understand Zack's surprise. Why shouldn't he have trained Veery? It was practical in the end. His job was a dangerous one, and the chocobo chick had insisted on following him at all times. Still did. He hadn't quite figured out how to get Veery to use materia. It was still a work in progress. Abruptly, Zack stopped ahead of him, and Sephiroth strode up to join him. Lazily, he adjusted his grip on Masamune, tucking the blade behind him and out of his way. "Lost?" he asked, a small amused smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Zack shot him a sulky look and shrugged his shoulders. Buster Sword swayed with the movement. "A bit. That fight was confusing." Sephiroth gave a low chuckle, then strode off. "Perhaps," he said, "if you didn't leap around so much." "What? Hey!" Zack yelped. "Not everyone can just stand there and dance out of the way like you, Twinkle Toes." Sephiroth blinked once, then decided to ignore him. He doubted Zack required response anyway. It took a few minutes, but soon enough they reorientated and spotted the dark line of blackened debris. The Leslie-Laplace first attack had swept some of the snow away from the devastated avalanche base, revealing it to the naked eye. Veery stuck close as they moved towards it this time, close enough that Sephiroth could feel him rubbing up against his leg. Little remained of the entrance, just a broken, twisted metal door, half buried in the snow. Sephiroth stepped over it carefully, feeling it shift beneath his boots. Veery picked his way after him with a few soft, anxious chirps. The entrance hall itself was mostly destroyed. One wall was barely shoulder height, and the other no more than the level of his knees. It was slightly less chilly here, with some of the wind being blocked, though the thick drifts of snow had piled up against the walls. Behind him, the downed door rattled as Zack followed. "So glad I wasn't inside the place when it blew up," Zack muttered behind him. "Not that it wasn't close. We almost didn't get out of there because they let loose some—" Sephiroth lost track of his words, as sudden pain seared through his head from the base of his skull to his forehead. It was so unexpected, so overwhelming, that he found himself actually stumbling. The loud noise of his shoulder guard clashing against the metal wall was nearly drowned out by the rushing in his ears and the ache in his head. His hand flew up to grip at his forehead, fingers digging into his hair. He grimaced, eyes twisted shut, and attempted to shake off the cloying ache. Yet it would not go away. It stayed and swept him under. Flashes of something came to him through the white noise of static and throbbing pain. Images of black, dressed, soldier-like fighters. A woman in a lab coat. A disc. A blonde-haired female Turk. The inside of train cars. And overwhelming determination and desperation. The imagery and information faded quickly, as if it had been a mere dream. It left behind nagging knowledge, a certainty that he should hold on to it, that it meant something. But it slipped away before he could even try. In its wake, Sephiroth found himself left with nothing but the heated throb in his temples. He clutched his hair harder, as if the slight sting would be enough to distract him from the deeper pain behind his eyes. Slowly, the sound of Veery's distressed calls broke through to him along with the feel of tugging on his coat. Sephiroth moved his hand from his face and slanted a look down. He was unsurprised to find Veery pressed up against his legs, stretched up as far as he could reach, tugging his coat between warbles. "Sephiroth?" Zack's voice carried a worried tone to it. When Sephiroth glanced up, he found him standing a few feet away, with Buster Sword lodged in the snow to free up his hands. "You okay?" Sephiroth pushed Veery's beak away from the buckle he was worrying on. patted his crest, then straightened. The bird gave a plaintive little chirp, but quieted quickly enough. Despite Sephiroth's attempts to shoo him away, Veery persistently remained close enough to keep a foot on one of Sephiroth's boots. "It's fine. Just a headache," he replied, head ducked to hide behind the fall of his hair. His temples still throbbed. There had been many headaches recently, many more than he was used to. In fact, before Cloud Strife had fallen into his life, there hadn't been any. Headaches had happened to others, and these persistent, reoccurring migraines were beginning to become worrisome. Most notably was the one he'd suffered during his and Cloud's battle in the soldier training room. The sudden, lancing pain had been enough to distract him and allow the behemoth they'd been fighting to strike him down briefly. Zack made a frustrated noise and reached out towards him. Sephiroth stepped away quickly. Zack dropped his hand while his other flew up to smooth over his hair. "You and Cloud are always saying the same thing," he cut off abruptly, an odd expression passing over his face. For a minute he looked at Sephiroth, his eyes tracing his face, before flicking off back the way they'd come. He let out a sharp breath and yanked his sword free, then propped it over his shoulder. "You know what? I'm not going to argue with you about it right now. Let's get this over with." Sephiroth stared after him, bewildered by the sudden change in behavior. He narrowed his eyes in suspicion at Zack's back, unable to stop the calculating thoughts that raced through his mind. Did Zack suspect something? Did he know something in regards to what was affecting him? For now, there was the mission to concentrate on, so Sephiroth shooed Veery away and followed after Zack. He hadn't gone far before he found the other soldier loitering at what had once been an intersection. The halls to the right and left of them were blocked by rubble, but ahead of them a wider, more open part of the base remained free of debris. One of the walls had been knocked down, leaving an opening that led further into the destruction with a pathway made of rubble. "It was a trap last time," Zack said, voice low and tight. "They set the self-destruct on us, and had already cleared the base." Sephiroth gave a faint hum. It was easy enough to tell that Zack was wary. "I wonder," Sephiroth said, "what it is that's troubling you so much. Is it this mission, or leaving Cloud behind?" Zack shot him a look that echoed his previous, odd and somehow uneasy, before it softened into a grin. Cheekily, he thumbed his nose. "Oh, I'm worried about Cloud, all right. That kid, he just attracts trouble," he said glibly. "To tell you the truth, though, I'm more worried about the other guys with him. Cloud can take care of himself." "Saying is with them," Sephiroth pointed out, "as is Cloud." The thought was half grudging, but he admitted it regardless. Cloud Strife could stand against his power, though he'd yet been able to test it completely, like an equal. Somehow, the idea that Cloud Strife was an equal, that he had an equal, was more unsettling than the idea that he and Zack mirrored Genesis and Angeal. He shut it away, not in the least eager to pursue the thought. The only problem would come if that girl appeared, the one who had been able to block his attacks. Elfe. To fight for a reason. It had been more than a year since the encounter, though the words still stuck with him, plagued him. She was as much a curiosity as Cloud was. Perhaps less, given Cloud's growing mystery. Zack's laughter drew Sephiroth from his thoughts, and his words ushered them away.
I know, but he's my friend. And so is Tseng. I can't help but be worried. Weren't you worried when it was Angeal and Genesis in danger? They were as good as you, after all.
Sephiroth frowned momentarily, unsure how to answer. He had been worried, he recalled. Worried and angry and resentful about so many things. He supposed he could understand the irrationality of it. Zack was just far more vocal about it. Yes, he said at last, but I was more concerned that I would be forced to kill them myself. Zack twisted to look at him. Sephiroth wondered if that was pity he was seeing in his expression.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a problem,
Zack said faintly. I'm not sorry I wound up with those missions, you know? Not really. He had to look away from Zack, away from the patient smile and the sympathetic eyes. With the red hilt of Buster Sword gripped in his hand, it was almost too much like Angeal to bear. You seemed to, at the time.
I've had a lot of time to think about it, and I'm kind of glad now. It gave me a chance to try, you know? To try and bring Angeal back.
Sephiroth looked up at the words, and Zack's grin widened a bit more. Zack reached up and tapped his temple with a finger.
Besides, I'm a lot smarter than people think, and I get the feeling you don't have as much freedom to act as I used to think you did.
The insight sent something both cold and light through him. It was a disturbing revelation that Zack was getting so close. Learning things so quickly. Almost too close. Sephiroth wasn't sure he was comfortable with that. He looked away, scanning the ruins around them, while the white clouds from his breath filled his peripheral vision. You could put it that way, and one day soon, eventually you won't either. Zack might never be as tied down as Sephiroth was, or even as Angeal and Genesis had been. He was a different type of soldier. That didn't stop Sephiroth from seeing the signs, from seeing Shinra slowly tightening its grasp on Zack. And eventually that clutch would spread to Cloud as well. Then Shinra would have 3 caged powers to do their work again, just like before. Sephiroth wondered what the fallout would be this time. To his surprise, Zack gave a dry bark of laughter.
I don't know, maybe I'll retire before then, he said blithely. Anyway, let's get this done. Come on.
Sephiroth watched him stride towards the gaping hole, loose metal rattling under his boots. He frowned incredulously at the strange phrase. Either Zack was unaware of his own importance, or Sephiroth was still missing too many of the bigger pieces of the strange puzzle unfolding before him. After a moment more of consideration, he turned to Viri. The chocobo chirped and tilted his head curiously under Sephiroth's regard.
Down,
he commanded. It took a little gentle pressure on the bird's back to get him to fold his legs and sink to the floor. But down he went. Viri gave him a doe-eyed look of sadness as soon as he realized what was happening.
Stay.
Sephiroth ignored the plaintive queh as he turned in a flutter of hair and leather and followed after Zack. There was no reason to bring the bird into what could turn into another fight. Best to leave him behind. Beyond the open wall, the base was little more than twisted paths of debris. There were sections where the wall and ceiling was still intact, though for the most part it was nothing but rubble. Sephiroth stepped lightly down the grade of snow and metal to join Zack at the base. Zack was crouched down, Buster Sword still balanced over his shoulder.
I don't know, Sephiroth. I haven't seen any tracks around here.
The snow here is near constant. It's unlikely any would remain for long.
Particularly with that snowstorm last night, right? And the blizzard those monsters kicked up.
Zack glanced towards the northeast, eyes narrowed against the breeze and the snow it carried on it.
Looks like the place is pretty much destroyed over there, so I guess we should head the other way.
Sephiroth let Zack lead the way through the twisting paths of the debris. Eventually they made their way into one of the areas of the base that had remained standing. Snow had blown into the metal hallway, coating the floor in long lines, and a faint dusting near the entrance. Frost clung heavily to the walls, one of which was adorned with a burst water pipe that was covered in a twisted mass of knobbly ice. Half of the hallway's floor was frozen over, where the water had spilled. The thin veneer of ice cracked beneath their boots with every step, turning brittle and white where it didn't simply shatter. There was a sudden splash ahead of them, and Zack froze.
"That's odd," Zack said. "It's all melted over here."
He took a few more steps forward, turning as he did so. Each of his steps landed with a small splash of water. Sephiroth moved forward, and as he advanced, the ice gave more easily beneath his boots, so that water gushed up through the cracks to pool atop the thin layer of ice. Zack gave a low sound ahead of him.
"It's just water up here, and I think... is that light?"
Sephiroth came to a halt a few steps behind Zack. Beyond Zack, a faint golden-red glow flickered through a doorway. Sephiroth crossed his arms over his chest, eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The air is warmer as well.
"Yeah, we definitely found something."
Before Sephiroth could respond, Zack strode forward towards the doorway. With a faint frown, Sephiroth tightened his grip on Masamune's hilt and followed after him. He had only just cleared the doorway when Zack gave a sudden, shocked yelp from several paces ahead. He jerked his head up in time to see Zack smack a wildly grinning bomb away from him with the flat of Buster's sword. There was a roaring crackle all around them, and when Sephiroth chanced to glance upward, he found at least a dozen more of the beasts swooping overhead.
"Shit!"
Zack's yell was accompanied by a harsh clang. A second later, Sephiroth felt a pair of arms wrap around his waist. There was a roar of an explosion, and the wash of heat, alongside a confusing feel of vertigo. For a moment, everything was confused sound and movement. His back hit the metal floor a second later, his head a heartbeat after. It ushered his headache back with a fury, as did the continued cacophony of exploding bombs. When at last the noise died down, Sephiroth blinked away the spots in his vision, more from the bright flare of the first bomb than the blow to the head. Zack's weight pressed down on him, his breath washing against Sephiroth's collarbone. He was able to make out Zack's shouting through the fading ringing in his ears.
"Sorry, that was my bad. Definitely my bad."
"Zack," he said calmly. The silence was immediate and welcomed. Slowly, Zack lifted himself up, his legs straddling Sephiroth's hips. The movement pulled at his coat and made Masamune dig deeper into his back, where the landing had twisted the long blade. He was lucky it wasn't cutting into him through the leather.
"Yeah?"
Zack asked. He was obviously concerned, though Sephiroth could not bring himself to care much. He was too uncomfortable with the proximity, as well as the pounding in his temples.
"Off."
The command worked often enough with fury. Zack jerked back sharply and scrambled aside with another yelped apology. Sephiroth winced as his movements yanked at his hair.
"Oh man, I didn't mean to do that either,"
Zack whimpered weakly.
"I'm sorry, Sephiroth."
He reached out towards him again. Sephiroth waved the outstretched hand away. "Just remove yourself." Sephiroth sat up slowly, careful where his hand settled. Zack flopped down onto his back a few feet away.
Just trying to help. It's unnecessary. Sephiroth shook his hair back, then pulled himself to his feet. He moved back towards the door, into the room the bombs had occupied. Behind him, Sephiroth heard Zack shifting, and a second later there was a disgruntled, surprised noise. Hey, Sephiroth? Could you give me a hand? Sephiroth glanced back over his shoulder to see Zack still prone. At his attention, Zack attempted to sit up, only to make it no more than a few inches. He struggled briefly, then fell back. Sephiroth frowned at him. He hadn't seemed injured before. My harness is stuck, Zack offered meekly. Sephiroth flicked a glance over Zack, then at the floor he was laid out on. Metal, like the rest of the base, and he knew that Zack, like Angeal before him and many other soldiers, used a magnetic harness to keep their swords in place on their back. He gave a sharp snort of amusement and turned away again. No. After all, the magnet was powerful enough to hold the sword, but they were still able to pull it free. Zack should be able to pull himself free. Perhaps it was a matter of leverage. Easily ignoring the sound of Zack's struggles, Sephiroth stepped into the room. Ash fell from the ceiling and had piled up on the floor as heavily as the snow outside. He stepped among the piles carefully, all too aware of how damaging even a piece of a bomb could be if it remained. Bomb arms were a common enough supplement for their explosives in a pinch. Sephiroth crouched down in the center of the room, angling Masamune to the side, and idly swiped his fingers through the ash. It was odd that there would be bombs here of all places. They were indigenous to other areas, and while there were definitely certain species that could be found in colder climates, they weren't exactly known for frequenting the snowfields of the icicle area. And for so many to be in a single place, bombs rarely congregated, and certainly never in such large groups. Zack had said it was a trap last time. It was easy enough to speculate that it had been a trap this time as well. But to what end? This was not damaging enough to kill a quick-witted infantryman, let alone soldier operatives. Then it stood to reason that... a distraction? He wouldn't be surprised. It certainly had all of the hallmarks. They'd been lured back to the base, and the attack beyond it. While it was possible that the snow and the lesser ploths hadn't been part of this, there had been enough traffic in the area of a supposed abandoned base to attract them. He stood in a rustle of leather and picked up the Buster Sword from where it lay in the ash. Turning on his heel, he strode back to where Zack was still struggling to rise, reached down and caught a hold of the front of his harness to yank him free. Zack was quick to get his feet under him as Sephiroth hauled him up, though he still staggered when Buster Sword was shoved into his hands. "We need to return," Sephiroth said sharply. "What? Hey, wait up!" Sephiroth ignored Zack's calls, already on the move. He needed to retrieve Veery first, and then they would need to make a hasty return trip across the snowfield.
Cloud pressed his forehead against his aching knees as the low noise of troopers bustled around the camp filled his ears. Zack leaned away against the truck next to him with his head in his hands, with Cloud curled on the bed of the vehicle. Sephiroth stood a few feet away, staring off across the camp, while nearby the captain stumbled through a mostly incoherent account of what had happened after the two had left. This had been the tableau for the last 10 minutes, and it did nothing to improve Cloud's admittedly foul mood. Waking up feeling like all his joints were on fire had left Cloud aggravated and confused that morning. He couldn't remember doing anything that would lead to the aching pain. Yet somehow, every bend and move of his knees and elbows, and even his ankles, wrists, and hips, creaked like a rusty hinge. It was the most miserable Cloud had felt physically since the last time he'd fallen in Mako, actually. Charitably, he wondered if Zack had found some and dumped it on him last night, since aside from the cold, his friend appeared perfectly fine.
Man, I just can't leave you on your own for a few hours, can I?
Zack groaned, his voice muffled by his hands.
You're like a bandersnatch with its tail on fire, always attracting trouble.
Cloud grunted back, too irritated to rise to his friend's bait. The sound of approaching footsteps made him glance up. As he neared, Tseng handed off a makeshift ice pack back to the trooper at his side, who carried a medical kit. The Turk's shirt was untucked, as he'd been tending to his wounds as best they could, with their sparse supplies. Cloud did have a cure on him, but he couldn't be bothered to speak up. Tseng could survive a little bruising, and maybe he was a little bit bitter because the materia hadn't worked on his own aches.
Thank you, Captain. I will take over from here,
Tseng said briskly, tucking his shirt back in with a few efficient moves. The white cloth was hopelessly wrinkled, thanks to the moisture and tumble he'd suffered, but when the trooper handed him his coat, a moment later, Tseng managed to seem mostly presentable, at least from the front. Cloud knew the back of the suit was stained with mud, and he snorted softly into his knees in amusement. Once he was dismissed, the captain immediately took off with a relieved look on his face. Cloud hadn't been paying much attention. Most of what he heard of the captain's report had been a long series of ums and you sees. Now, however, Tseng stood tall, his face a mask of seriousness. He looked ready to make a full and concise report. Cloud buried his face in his knees again. He didn't need to hear how he'd drawn even more attention to himself. Childishly, he didn't want Zack to know, as if that would somehow make things less disastrous. His bitter thoughts were interrupted as Tseng spoke.
Sephiroth?
He began, not visibly bothered when Sephiroth didn't acknowledge him.
Zack? Hey, Tseng.
Zack replied, perking up and dropping his hands to his sides. He gave the Turk a lopsided grin.
I don't suppose you're here to fill us in on what happened.
Tseng gave Zack a dry smile, his dark eyes flicking to Cloud. Cloud narrowed his eyes and wished he could find the energy to uncurl from his position and walk away. The stiffness of his movements would be immediately obvious to anyone with eyes, which in turn would mean he wouldn't be allowed to get away anyway.
Indeed,
Tseng said.
I don't know how much of Captain Stevens' report you understood. He was too busy being intimidated by Sephiroth,
Zack drawled pointedly,
who wasn't even looking at him.
Tseng shot a look at the aforementioned man and raised an eyebrow at Zack.
I seem to recall you were intimidated by Sephiroth at one time as well. I almost wonder where your sense of self-preservation has gone.
Zack, Cloud cut in, just knowing his friend was about to say something completely irrelevant. He felt a pulse of amusement that was not his own, and scowled into his knees as he pushed it away. It did nothing to improve his mood.
Oh, you're talking now?
Zack asked with an unrepentant grin. Clamping his lips together, even if Zack couldn't see it, Cloud remained stubbornly silent. He had no idea what Tseng was talking about. Zack had no shame. Snorting softly, Zack gestured for Tseng to continue.
Approximately 20 minutes after you and Sephiroth left,
the camp was approached by a single avalanche operative.
Zeng said.
After the troopers proved ineffectual, Cloud stepped in and apprehended the intruder.
Apprehended. Cloud suppressed a grimace. More like sat on until Zack and Sephiroth arrived, since the man would have broken free of any guard from the troopers. Glancing over his shoulder, he sighed quietly. Fury was curled up on one of the benches, sleeping the sleep of the exhausted, and further back was the still form slumped in the corner of the truck. He wasn't certain what Sephiroth had done, but the intruder had remained unconscious in his bounds since then. Avalanche. He hated that most of all. This was not his ragtag band of misfits, and it still felt like these people were dragging the name through the mud. There was silence, and Cloud mentally counted down the seconds. Zeng hadn't gone into details like he'd expected, but all that meant was...
Wait, that's it?
Zack asked, incredulous.
You can't just leave it like that. You left out almost everything.
Zack would hardly leave such an open-ended statement alone. Cloud wished he would. Maybe if it was just he and Zack, he would have been in a more charitable mood and come clean. But the unignorable presence of Sephiroth brought out Cloud's obstinate side. Somehow, he felt Zeng was riling Zack up on purpose. Bastard.
Not all of us have the need to expound on every detail, Zack.
Zeng said blandly. Zack spluttered in affronted frustration. Before he could say more, there was the sound of shuffling footsteps and a yelp, and from around the side of the truck, Connolly and several other troopers staggered. Connolly had a sheepish look on his face when he caught Cloud's eyes, and he staggered again as one of the troopers behind him pushed him forward. Cloud had to repress a strong urge to groan out loud. He recognized the starry look in the trooper's eyes. Truthfully, he should have been more careful for all of today. When they'd accepted this mission, neither he nor Zack had known the attending patrol was Cloud's old unit. It was only when Connolly joined them that Cloud had realized, and by then he was too miserable with aches to care. After Zack had left with Sephiroth, though, some of the black feelings had lifted. Not enough to still Cloud's tongue when he was confronted with his old mates. Thankfully, Connolly had drawn attention from his blunder, but Cloud had been all too aware of Zeng. Not that Zeng had made any effort to hide his eavesdropping. Luckily for him, they had accepted it as a tasteless joke. He had become complacent in his place in this time, and was beginning to forget that what he knew, or in this case didn't know, could get him in trouble. If that continued, he would find himself in more danger than from a few fumbling attempts at heckling. Connolly shifted forward a few steps and sent Cloud a chagrined look.
Sorry, Cloud. I couldn't keep them away,
he mumbled, rubbing the back of his neck. His helmet was missing, though Cloud suspected if he checked on the side of the truck, he could find where it had been dropped. It was obvious the group had been lurking.
Connolly!
Zack said brightly, straightening from his slouched position. In a heartbeat, he was next to the bewildered Connolly, and had thrown his arm around his shoulders.
My absolute favorite trooper. You and your buddies can tell me what happened, right?
He gave the startled group a pleading look to accompany his words.
None of these guys will tell me all the juicy details. It must be nice to be in the normal army. I bet you guys get all the good gossip.
Zack ignored the futile protests as he dragged Connolly back over to his position next to Cloud, waving enthusiastically for the other 4 troopers to come closer. Cloud kicked out at the back of Zack's head, but his friend blocked it offhandedly and ignored Cloud's grunt of displeasure. The abrupt movement had hurt, too. Cloud grit his teeth as he drew his leg back slowly, trying not to wince. The aches were becoming more pronounced after sitting curled up in the cold air for so long.
Zack,
Tseng said with a frown.
we have matters to discuss. Nuh-uh,
Zack said, wiggling a finger at Tseng and clutching Connolly to his side more firmly. What Cloud could see of the trooper's expression was taking on a traumatized look Cloud was all too familiar with.
I have a very important mission I need to complete before you try to put me to sleep with Shinra Protocol. Since you won't tell me, I'll have to make like a Turk and interrogate these guys.
You're not a Turk, Cloud mumbled uncharitably into his knees.
Kunzel is. Kunzel's an alien.
Well, Cloud couldn't really argue that. Kunzel's ability to gather information was out of this world.
Now then,
Zack continued.
who wants to go first? Report!
The trooper snapped to attention immediately at the sharp command, and saluted on what could only have been automatic. This time Cloud's kick hit Zack's shoulder guard, and his friend snickered unrepentantly. The troopers quickly realized that despite his rank, Zack wasn't expecting them to remain at attention. It could have been the way he kept an arm firmly clamped around Connolly's shoulder to prevent the trooper from slipping away. That didn't change the fact that it had been an order, and Zack was waiting patiently for them to respond. Nevertheless, they relaxed out of their stances with only a few nervous looks at Tseng and the distant Sephiroth. Cloud allowed himself a moment of vain hope that Sephiroth's presence would work on them as well as it had worked on the captain.
It was amazing!
One of the troopers blurted out. There went that hope. As if that had been the signal, all four began talking rapidly, trying to make themselves heard over each other.
I thought we were going to die. Didn't you see him move? That sword was just... Captain called it a retreat. Took him down in one hit. Couldn't hit him at all. Whoa, whoa, whoa!
Zack said, raising both hands in front of him as if to ward off the barrage of words. The four instantly went silent, and Cloud was sure he heard one of their teeth clacking together sharply with how quickly his mouth shut. Connolly took the opportunity to try to slip away, but Zack reached out a hand to pull him back.
Hey, stick around, Connolly. I know I can get a straight answer from you.
Zack's grin said full well he had heard the trooper's reluctant whine.
Now then,
he continued blithely, holding up a finger.
One more time, one at a time, please and thank you.
There was silence as the troopers shifted where they stood, before one blew out a harsh breath.
Damn, man, it was just... No one really expected, well, that to happen.
He began.
I mean, we were ready for an attack, but it was just one guy. He took out the patrols on his way in.
Another put in.
Mavers and Harrison.
Connolly said reluctantly from Zack's side.
They're not dead, but Harrison lost his arm in the fight.
Zack grimaced with regret, a sentiment Cloud echoed. Logically, there was nothing he could have done, since he couldn't be everywhere. But the loss of a limb was the worst injury of the skirmish, and one that he felt shouldn't have happened at all. There was no need for it. The intruder was powerful enough to have avoided the patrol without interaction. Instead, he had picked a deliberately crippling blow. Cloud resisted the urge to turn a glare on the unmoving body behind him. It wasn't like the unconscious man would appreciate it.
Yeah.
One of the troopers muttered angrily.
Bastard kept coming, too. Managed to dodge all our bullets. What the hell is with that, anyway? Does Avalanche have soldiers too or something? That is currently classified information.
Tseng spoke up. He didn't sound apologetic at all, stating it as a mere fact. Cloud narrowed his eyes in annoyance. There was something familiar about the attacker, as if Cloud had met someone like him before. He'd been briefly overwhelmed when the deja vu hit so hard, but none of the memories were clear enough. What was Tseng hiding? The trooper that had complained scowled darkly.
What? You can't expect us to just forget what we saw. Hey now, soldier, keep it cool.
Zack interrupted, holding up a restraining hand. He gave the agitated trooper an understanding smile.
Why don't you grab a buddy and walk it off? We're all pretty tense right now.
One of the other troopers immediately grabbed the disgruntled one by the elbow and followed Zack's advice. As the pair disappeared back the way they'd come from, Zack sighed and ran a hand through his hair, releasing Connolly in the same movement. Connolly swayed and shot Zack a bewildered look, clearly wondering why he was being let go. Zack ignored him for a moment as he turned to Tseng.
I'm sure you and the other Turks will be giving them all a thorough debriefing, though. Ha! It is necessary,
Tseng said simply. Zack winced slightly.
Yeah, those are never fun.
He slumped against the side of the truck, sinking down so his elbows were propped on the truck bed and his feet were sprawled in front of him. He looked extremely uncomfortable, but Zack didn't appear to be bothered by the awkward position.
Well?
He prompted after a moment. He tilted his head so he could pin the troopers with one of his glowing blue eyes. Connolly said, looking confused.
Well, what?
Zack let out an impatient huff and got his feet under him again.
Well, you were supposed to be telling me what Cloud doesn't want you to, of course.
The two remaining troopers exchanged a look, and even with the helmets obscuring most of their expressions, Cloud could read the clear uncertainty. Zack's switching from reasonable commander to petulance was a normal reaction, but the troopers weren't familiar with his mannerisms. Soldiers, to them, were unfathomable mysteries.
So, bad guy makes it to the camp. Then what? Well,
one of the troopers echoed.
The captain was right on top of things. No idea how he knew, but he was already ordering us into line before the guy got into the perimeter. Didn't help at all, though.
The second trooper said glumly.
Like Heath said, the guy was able to dodge all our shots. Even sent ricochets back and got a few of the guys. Yeah, well, the bastard looked like he was going to start attacking, and then the next thing any of us know, Cloud is just there.
The first trooper shot a thinly veiled look of admiration at Cloud, which he pointedly ignored.
Saved my brother's life. I thought, well, he stopped the guy in his tracks. None of us really believed what they said about Cloud, but seeing him beat that guy back there so easily, that... He trailed off, unable to find words to express himself. Cloud looked unseeingly at the canvas cover of the truck. Yes, he'd beaten the attacker back. At first, he'd matched blows with him, trying to balance keeping the surrounding troopers safe, with his desire not to give Tseng more ammunition for his curiosity. He wasn't entirely sure what he was up against. The man had clearly been enhanced, but Cloud was pretty sure it wasn't a soldier. Cloud hadn't recognized him when his helmet had been removed. At this point, he was familiar with most of the soldiers. It was possible it was an earlier deserter, though. I thought the guy got Cloud for a minute, though.
The second trooper picked up the narrative. Zack turned and shot Cloud a look that promised if he was really injured, nothing would stop Zack from bundling him to the nearest inn to recover. Cloud looked away, unwilling to confirm the lie. He hadn't been injured.
Must have knocked him silly for a bit because, The
trooper trailed off when it was clear Zack was paying him no attention, still staring pointedly at Cloud. He'd been chasing the familiar feeling the fight had given him, chasing after an elusive recollection he couldn't put into words. The dark clothes, the sword, even the fighting style had drawn out flashes of a different place. It had triggered a memory relapse, the likes of which he hadn't suffered in forever. A few moments, and a lifetime passed as he was overwhelmed by the barrage of images. A train, a mission, rage at the loss of his companions, and always that deep burning need to prove himself, to prove that he was worth something. Cloud had given in to the anger the new memories had unleashed. There was no solid reason, the foggy picture in his mind only telling him that this man was his enemy and had done something unforgivable. Perhaps it was a combination of the pain that had plagued him all morning with the rush of emotion that had done it. Whatever the precise cause, he had lashed out.
"I could only follow a little bit,"
the first trooper said, shaking his head.
"The guy was heading right for the captain, when suddenly he went flying through the air."
He smacked his fist against the opposite palm to simulate the sound.
"Next thing, Cloud appears out of nowhere and kicks him straight up. Then we all saw them hit the ground, and the guy was completely pinned. It took like 2 seconds, and then it was just over,"
the second trooper added, gesturing wildly. He shouldn't have lost control like that. He could have found another way of taking out the attacker that wouldn't have caused such an uproar. Or... Cloud gave the camp a surreptitious glance, remembering how little the troopers had been able to affect the attacker. If he hadn't have taken out the attacker as fast as he had, there would have been more casualties than just bullet wounds and a missing arm. Still, after he'd pinned the attacker, it had been a painful half-hour of being the center of attention, as troopers facilitated between awestruck reverence and bitter confusion. Not all of them had been impressed at Cloud's physical feat, jealousy thick in their glaring eyes and quiet hisses. It was one thing to see a soldier in action, and another to see Cloud Strife, former runt of the squad, destroying the enemy so thoroughly. Cloud doubted many of the troopers had seen a soldier in action. The captain had kept order despite the confusion, which Cloud had to admit was an impressive accomplishment. He'd awkwardly offered to help Cloud tie up the struggling man, which Cloud had sensibly declined as he'd strained to keep him pinned. Ironically, it was thanks to Zack that he'd been able to keep him restrained. Zack wasn't shy about tackling Cloud into the odd wrestling match when he was feeling restless, giving Cloud plenty of practice at keeping a larger opponent pinned. Zack's low whistle brought Cloud's wandering attention back from his thoughts.
"Yeah, I've seen Cloud pull that move a few times. I swear he fights better in the air than on the ground."
Another flare of amusement trickled through Cloud's defense as a low chuckle broke through after Zack's words. Sephiroth had moved in closer and was, in fact, standing a mere few feet behind the troopers, all of which had jumped guiltily. Cloud really tried not to take vindictive pleasure in that.
"He is rather agile."
Zack laughed lightly over the stutters of one of the troopers.
"That he is. So, Connolly, anything to add? Or did these guys cover everything important?"
Connolly peered his nervous look away from Sephiroth to stare blankly at Zack before the question registered.
No, that was about..."
He paused and looked like he wanted to say something else, but decided against it.
"That was about all." Sir?
One of the troopers interjected hastily. When Zack raised a questioning brow, he bowled on.
"Is there anything else?" "Nah, sorry to keep you,"
Zack said, cheerfully waving them away. The two troopers wasted no time in scrambling back across the camp. Connolly hesitated, however. He sent an apologetic look at Cloud before turning to face Zack fully.
Is Cloud still having reactions to the Mako?
He asked boldly. Cloud jerked his head up in surprise, not having expected Connolly to be the one to bring attention to his collapse. Before he could even think of how to respond to that, he found himself abruptly on his back, his arms pinned next to his head, as Zack sat astride his hips. Connolly's sharp gasp of surprise was almost lost in the rattle of Cloud's harness and Zack's boots hitting the metal floor. Buster's sword lent Zack extra weight, making it impossible for Cloud to shove him away. There was a startled, sleepy warble from Veery, but after raising his head briefly, the bird tucked it under his wing again, ignoring the humans that had disturbed him. Shooting Zack a look of mixed betrayal and embarrassment, Cloud didn't bother struggling under the warm weight of his friend. Not yet, at least.
There, now you can't get away until I get my answers.
Despite the grin on his face, Zack's eyes were serious and worried, which almost made Cloud squirm in guilt.
Zack,
he hissed, too aware of their audience. Why Zack insisted on being difficult at the worst of times was something he would never understand.
Let me up. Not this time,
Zack said, with so much cheerfulness that Cloud couldn't resist trying to bring a leg up to kick him. It was a futile effort, as Zack had him efficiently pinned.
The longer you take to tell me what happened, the longer we sit here nice and cozy.
The cold from the floor was seeping through Cloud's shirt, chilling his skin, and Zack's move had jostled his arms and shoulder into a fresh spike of pain. It quickly dulled back into that constant ache. It was anything but comfortable, especially since the warmth from Zack's gloves on his wrists felt nice in contrast.
Get off,
Cloud said flatly, and tried to twist out of the grip again. The more Zack pushed at him to answer, the less Cloud wanted to. Zack had enough details, and unless he wanted Cloud to tell the whole world about his missing memory, it wasn't like there was anything else he could add. Part of Cloud was aware he was being unfair, while a larger part of him pushed that thought away petulantly.
I could always have Connolly see if you're ticklish or something,
Zack said, twisting so he could look over his shoulder. Using the moment of distraction, Cloud bucked hard against the larger body above them, but Zack had been prepared for it and shifted backwards to negate the move. Grunting, Cloud sank back against the floor and turned his head away. One of the hardest things he had to learn was that while he was still very strong physically, Zack was equally as strong. There had been no one in his old life who could have, or would have, been able to stay Cloud's strength when he really wanted to get away. It still surprised him sometimes that Zack managed it so effortlessly.
I think I'm already in enough trouble, sir. Zack,
Connolly piped up. Cloud couldn't see the trooper around Zack's bulk, but silently swore that if there really was laughter he heard in his voice, Connolly would be in trouble.
Then at least finish what you started. I'll make sure Cloud here can't get to you until you get a good head start, okay?
The sound of Connolly swallowing heavily was loud in the relative silence that surrounded the truck. Much to Cloud's disgust, however, he did begin speaking.
Well,
he said haltingly.
When the guy knocked Cloud away, he, collapsed for a minute.
The last part came out nearly inaudible, as whatever confidence Connolly had ebbed away. Zack sat back lightly, enough so that he could crane his neck around without too much trouble. The firm grip on Cloud's wrists didn't lessen, however, and Cloud turned his attention to the texture of leather against his bare wrists. The heat Zack always exuded anything but the knowledge he was currently being sat on by his friend for not wanting to speak. It was in some ways a relief that Connolly was the only normal soldier to witness the humiliation, and so much worse in other ways, knowing who else was.
Yeah, I got that much. What made you think it was the Mako, though? Hey, Cloud, you haven't gone swimming in it again without my permission, right?
The last part was said cheerfully in Cloud's face, as Zack leaned in close enough that he could feel the breath across his cheek. Forced to repress a shiver at the warmth, he tried to headbutt Zack, more in an effort to shake off the reaction. It was just Zack being Zack, after all.
I've seen Cloud fight a couple of times since the accident. At Medill, and another time.
Cloud didn't even have to look to know Connolly had shot Sephiroth a nervous glance. Both times had ended with Cloud facing off against him, one way or another.
And, well, he's taken some pretty hard hits before, but it was just...
He trailed off uncertainly. Cloud could fill in the missing words.
It was just he appeared to go insane.
Would have fit nicely.
He shouldn't be.
Sephiroth's voice cut in smoothly again. He was frowning at Cloud now, green eyes narrowed slightly in contemplation.
The Mako should have settled long ago.
I'm fine, Cloud responded automatically, turning back to Zack so he could avoid the piercing gaze. Of course, that left him open to the wounded, pleading look on Zack's face. Sighing irritably, Cloud closed his eyes and let his head thunk back on the floor in defeat.
It was just a memory.
That was the only thing it could have been. One of his missing memories from before those years as Hojo's plaything. There was a time when Cloud had doubted his own existence due to his inability to recall his life, except where others had observed it as well. Through Tifa, or through Zack, most of his memories of the past were built off his experiences with them. Zhang's low voice cut in unexpectedly.
Cloud was on a mission with one of my subordinates. I believe his patrol was wiped out by a similar attack. It's no surprise he had an intense reaction.
Zack's eyebrows rose in surprise, and he gave Cloud a questioning look. Cloud frowned back, which really was all the answer Zack needed.
You could have just said you needed a hug.
Cloud made a low, derisive sound in the back of his throat, and pushed against Zack's hold more seriously.
Let me up, Zack.
To his relief, Zack did so, twisting and landing with a wet thump outside the truck again.
It's not my fault you like to keep these things bottled up,
Zack said. Cloud sat up slowly, still frowning as he rubbed his elbow absently. He wouldn't admit it to anyone, but he found he was missing the warmth Zack had exuded already.
Though, you know,
Zack continued as he leaned over to prod at Cloud, making sure he was paying attention.
We've had this talk before. I just wish you'd tell me what's been bothering you.
In the wake of everything else, complaining about a few aches seemed even worse, especially under Sephiroth's unwavering gaze. Connolly's guilty shifting and Zhang's calculated nonchalance. Unfortunately for Cloud, others didn't share his opinion.
He was harboring some injuries.
Zhang cut in smoothly. Cloud winced and glared at the Turk. Turks and their nosy meddling.
On his right knee and elbow, at least.
Zhang continued to study his notepad without paying any attention to the reaction he caused. Zack frowned and crossed his arms over his chest. Bright blue eyes narrowed. He idly shifted his weight a little more, resting one side of his hip against the bed of the truck.
Really, Cloud? And you couldn't tell me your health was compromised? I mean, let's forget for a moment that I'm your friend, but I'm kind of your commanding officer too. It's not important,
Cloud mumbled, a thread of guilt worming its way into his gut.
It didn't slow me down.
Zack gave a heavy sigh, momentarily passing his gloved hands over his forehead. He was still frowning at Cloud, as if he kicked Buster's sword over or something.
That doesn't matter, Cloud.
Zack didn't even hesitate to reach out and take hold of his wrist, idly turning his hand over. Cloud could only frown faintly down at his grip as Zack absently rubbed his thumb against the inside of his wrist.
You're my buddy. I don't like it when my friends are hurting.
Connolly's uncertain voice broke the quiet, and both Cloud and Zack looked up at him, though Zack continued with the small, circular motions on Cloud's wrist. It was easing the ache there, much to his further guilt and relief. Connolly winced under Cloud's grumpy stare, but soldiered on.
Do you need me still, Zack? If you have things you need to get to, don't let us keep you.
Zack said easily, with another apologetic look at Cloud. Connolly beat a hasty retreat. Mentally sighing, Cloud promised that he'd track down Connolly later. He wasn't really mad at him. He was just annoyed that he was in this position in the first place, and that wasn't Connolly's fault. Almost as soon as he'd made the casual dismissal, Zack turned his attention back to Cloud. He had that patient, waiting expression on his face that Cloud found impossible to ignore. Zack was digging in to wait him out.
It started this morning,
Cloud said reluctantly, looking away and focusing again on the canvas inside of the truck. He began counting the stitches in the cloth in an attempt to distract himself from the odd, fluttery feeling in his stomach.
Just aches.
Zack frowned again and slid his other hand up Cloud's forearm to grip his elbow.
At the joints?
He asked, voice quiet. He began to carefully rub it, digging his thumb into it gently.
Just a deep ache, huh? Not like you pulled it or anything.
No, Cloud broke off with a quiet sound as Zack found a particularly sore spot.
I didn't do anything that would have caused it.
The ache was quickly dissipating under Zack's warm, firm touch. In contrast, Cloud's other joints seemed to pulse more fiercely in reaction.
The
low sound was thoughtful, and Zack gave a familiar crooked smile, the one that always made a slight dimple appear in his cheek.
Is this helping?
Yeah, Cloud said reluctantly. More than helping. It felt very, very nice, and he was already dreading when Zack would stop. Zack laughed, low and quiet, and somehow wickedly amused.
Well, I don't think it's anything serious.
Cloud gave Zack an unimpressed look at his dramatics. Zack was no medic, as he often proclaimed loudly, and especially around Aerith, but it sounded as if he knew what had caused the aches and pains. Zack cracked another grin.
Cloud, you're all of what, 15? You're probably just hitting a growth spurt.
The simple proclamation sent a shock through Cloud, pushing aside all the warm flutters and odd tingles Zack's touch had produced, and left him feeling cold. 15? His age wasn't something Cloud paid much attention to, merely noting when another year passed by. He felt too old, too worn from everything he'd experienced. Now he had to cope with being far too young.
But
he said haltingly, not knowing exactly what he wanted to say, yet knowing he couldn't say it anyway in their present company. Zack seemed to take pity on him and reached up to tap the side of his head. Unfortunately, that meant he released Cloud's elbow to do it.
Just because you think you have a good head on your shoulders doesn't mean your body agrees. On the bright side, that probably means you're getting taller.
His face brightened, and a moment later, Zack was tugging Cloud out of the truck by his wrist.
Come on, stand up straight.
Cloud succumbed to his friend's prodding, still numb with the unexpected shock. Once he had Cloud situated to his satisfaction, Zack lifted Buster Sword off his back to prop it carefully against the side of the truck. Then he circled around Cloud and pressed against him so they were back to back. Cloud jerked his head to the side as if to turn to look at Zack before he froze. What if he vanishes when I look? Fighting against the irrational panic, Cloud snapped his gaze forward again. That turned out to be a mistake as well. His eyes caught Sephiroth's bemused green gaze, and Cloud was caught up in a swirl of memory. But it was all wrong. Zack was warm and solid against his back. The aches in Cloud's body weren't from the bite of Masamune, and there was still that faint swirl of affable amusement curling in the back of his mind. Sephiroth was just standing there, looking both relaxed and mildly disheveled from whatever he and Zack had gotten up to on their leg of the mission. The stark contrast was enough to pull Cloud away from the dangerous emotions and memories.
What do you think, Tseng?
Zack's voice called, breaking the surreality of the moment.
Does he look taller?
Cloud blinked rapidly, trying to calm his pulse from the brief bout of panic. He thought he'd gotten over those inadvertent reactions to such parallels. Tseng gave a faint chuckle.
Maybe just a little.
Sephiroth turned his head aside, silvery hair falling across his face. Again, the brief curl of humor flickered, and this time Cloud didn't immediately recoil. It helped ground him in the now, rather than in the past, ghosts' echoes. He could be offended at it later.
Zack.
Tseng spoke up again.
Yeah, Tseng?
Zack asked, and Cloud felt him shifting slightly to crane his head around.
If we don't leave now, we'll run out of daylight.
Tseng said, flipping his notebook shut finally and slipping it back in his coat pocket.
You can brief me on your half of the mission on the way. Right, sorry.
Zack said jovially. He turned around and rested both hands on Cloud's shoulders, giving them a squeeze and leaning down slightly.
We're going to go visit the memorial for Asai and Sebastian. You want to come, or are you fine staying here?
Cloud tilted his head against the feeling of Zack's breath against his ear and considered the question. Not too long ago, he would have followed Zack without question, feeling his friend's biting guilt as starkly as his own. Now, though,
I'll stay,
he said. He respected Zack's loss, but there was no need for Cloud to join him on this particular mission. Zack gave his shoulder another squeeze before releasing them and stepping around him to retrieve Buster Sword.
All right, then. Let's go, Tseng.
Zack paused as he came up alongside the Turk. He glanced towards Sephiroth before looking back to Cloud. It looked as if he wanted to say something more, but then he shook his head and grinned easily.
We'll be back soon.
He turned away, one hand lifting in a little wave as he did so. The gesture brought a lump to Cloud's throat at the likeness. He watched Zack walk away, a dark figure against the white backdrop of the snowy landscape. A few flakes of snow began drifting down from the sky, a few landing on Cloud's cheek and melting from his body heat. Blinking against the moisture, he gave a sudden shudder as a flake landed on the back of his neck, as brief a sensation as a kiss. Sephiroth hadn't moved from his position, despite the weather. Cloud felt overwhelmed and wrung out. and the ache in his joints was flaring mercilessly. He gave Sephiroth one last look before turning back to the truck without a word. Veery wouldn't mind the company, and maybe it would help against the chill left from the memory of Zack's touch.